Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Audrey Isaacs. I'm the president of the City Club of New York. We are delighted to have you with us at a regular Friday luncheon program of the City Club. As you know, we are entering our second century of service to the citizens of this city. We bring you behind the scenes through our regular Friday luncheon program, through breakfast programs, evening programs, behind the scenes tours. For two reasons. We want you to be a fully informed citizen, and we want government officials to know that you and we are watching them. So, if you would like to meet us, if you would like to join us, you can come by on Fridays. We host these programs from the City University Graduate Center, 33 West 42nd Street in Manhattan. Or you can call us at 212-921-9870, and we will give you all the information you need so that you can become an active member of the City Club. As you know, every week we bring you prominent speakers to address prominent issues of the day. This week we have excellent speakers and we have an excellent moderator. The topic is term limitation, and our moderator, Mr. Dan Rose, will tell you all about it. Just a brief word on Mr. Rose. He is the president of Rose Associates. He is one of the most prominent real estate developers, as is his company, in New York City, and he also happens to be one of our more scintillating moderators. So I welcome you, Mr. Rose, and I turn the program over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Our discussion today reflects a widespread and growing national discontent with the way our society is governed. Voices as far apart on the political spectrum as the Boston Globe, the Nation magazine, and the Wall Street Journal have come out in favor of NOTA, N-O-T-A, none of the above, which is a vehicle by which a box appears on the ballot that you may check, which says that if NOTA wins, the other candidates who lose cannot even be on the ballot for the runoff election. Fascinating concept that we now, for the first time, hear serious people discussing seriously. The question of chairmanships of various legislative committees is under attack, and more voices are being raised for the direct election rather than mere elevation by seniority. And today's subject of term limitations is something that is a growing question in states and cities across the country, where it's an effort to deal with a political climate that seems to be heavily stacked in favor of the longtime incumbent and stacked dramatically against the would-be challenger. It's a burning issue, one of those questions whose time has come. It is not a new issue. Periclean Athens had strict term limitations, and Aristotle wrote very favorably about it. Venice, at its peak under the Doges, had strict term limitations. In the wonderful discussions, that wonderful correspondence between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson in their old age, these two wise and savvy old men exchanging letters, discussed the question of term limitations. Even our own Articles of Confederation of, 1787, had term limitations firmly, put in print, but it was omitted from our actual Constitution. It's a lively issue whose time for discussion, at least, has come. And the City Club is happy to have discussing it two individuals who are widely regarded as the most thoughtful and knowledgeable and articulate defenders of the respective points of view, one pro and one con. Edward Crane, of the highly regarded Cato Institute in Washington, is a highly regarded, widely read and listened to commentator, not only on the techniques of government, but on the goals and the effectiveness of government. Victor Kamber, head of the Kamber Group, is one of the nation's leading consultants to labor unions, to businesses, to public interest groups on a wide range of topics. These two gentlemen have each complimented us by having been willing to come all the way from Washington for today's discussions, and I think we're in for a lively exchange. Without our format will be for each of these gentlemen to have an opening comment for 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll have a free-form discussion between them with rebuttals in effect. And then, as is our standard practice, we'll be throwing the subject open to discussion from the floor, where questioners, we hope, number one, will identify themselves, number two, will ask questions, not make statements, and will be brief enough so that the next speaker can come on. Without further ado, we turn to Ed Crane for his opening statement on the subject of term limits. Ed?
Thank you, Dan. I should tell you, when Dan called and said, Ed, the City Club's going to be doing a program on term limits, who do you know who's the best spokesman against term limits? And I immediately said Vic Kamber. I mean, he's by far, in my experience, the most articulate and knowledgeable opponent of term limits. And Lord knows that lamentable position needs all the help it can get. And Dan said, okay, how about you being the proponent of term limits? And I said, well, okay, but now that I think about it, maybe Kamber isn't the best guy to bring up there. But the cat was out of the bag, and so I'm delighted. Actually, Vic and I have done this once before, and even though he's dead wrong on the issue, he does make a very powerful case for his side, and so I think it'll be a useful exchange of information. As most people know, last November, 14 states passed term limits. That was out of 14 states where term limit initiatives were on the ballot. We had one further state, Colorado, who had 2 years previously limited their congressional delegation. So 15 congressional delegations are now term limited. That comes to 152 members of the House and about 35% of the House and 30 members of the U.S. Senate. So a third of Congress is term limited already. The election results were overwhelming. Of the 14 states, the average victory was by 66%. The term limit proponents or proposals got more votes in 14 states than Ross Perot did in all 50. They outpolled Bill Clinton in every state they were on the ballot, with I think the exception of Arkansas. So this is an enormously popular proposition. It's also one, rather remarkably, that has very even demographic support. Women supported a little bit more than men. Blacks supported a little bit more than whites. Conservatives a little bit more than liberals. But overall, it's all up in the 65 to 80% range of support for term limits, and that's remarkable for any issue like that, to have that broad a base of support. Before I go forward with my case for term limits, let me read something that was written about more than 200 years ago. I'm president of the Cato Institute, and we are named after something called Cato's Letters, which were Revolutionary-era pamphlets that were widely distributed in the colonies in the early part of the 18th century. And I was delighted to run across a piece from them that dealt specifically with term limits. And I'm reading this, by the way, out of a book called Cleaning House, which is available from Regnery Gateway, and I think the best book available on term limits. It's written by John Fund and Jim Coyne. This is what the authors of Cato's Letters, John Trenchard and Thomas Gordon, wrote in the early part of the 18th century, the first half. Men, when they enter into office, have often their former condition before their eyes. They remember what they themselves suffered with their fellow subjects from the abuse of power and how much they blamed it. So their first purposes are to be humble, modest, and just, and probably for some time they continue so. But in the possession of power, soon alters and vitiates their heart, which are at the same time sure to have leavened and puffed up to an unnatural size by the deceitful incense of false friends and by the prostrate submission of parasites. First they grow indifferent to all their good designs, then drop them. Next they lose their moderation. Afterwards they renounce all measures with their old acquaintances and old principles, and seeing themselves in magnifying glasses, grow in conceit, a different species from their fellow subjects, and so by 2 sudden degrees become insolent, rapacious, and tyrannical, ready to catch all means, often the vilest and most oppressive, to raise their fortunes as high as their imaginary greatness. So that the only way to put them in mind of their former condition, and consequently of the condition of other people, is often to reduce them to it, and to let others of equal capacity share the power in their turn. This also is the only way to qualify men and make them equally fit for dominion and subjection. A rotation, therefore, in power and office is essentially necessary to a free government. And to that I would just say amen. I think that the case for term limits is one, as Dan Rose has mentioned, that goes back to antiquity. It's a logical case, a powerful case, and I think that Cato's letter presents it in a very, very concise and accurate manner. I would say that bringing it up to a contemporary situation, there are basically 3 solid reasons. I'm not going to go into all the discussion of the bank, the house bank checking scandals and the budget deals and the corruption and all the stuff that you see in the newspapers that people associate with term limits. I mean, we all know about that, and I'm not opposed to mentioning them, but that's not the substance of what I want to talk about today. There are 3 reasons, basic reasons, why I think term limits are a good idea. One is that currently we have what I would call an adverse pre-selection process in terms of the nature of the people seeking legislative office for Congress. Second, I think it's important to minimize the exposure of the people who do get elected to office to what I call the culture of ruling inside the Beltway. And third, it's important to create a citizen legislature as opposed to a professional legislature. So let me just address those issues in the time we have remaining. I say we have an adverse pre-selection process today because it is so difficult to get rid of an incumbent. We have a situation that over the last quarter of a century, we've had a 95% re-election rate over the last 24 years for House incumbents seeking re-election. It means that you're going to spend a long time in Congress if you get elected to Congress. What that also means is that if you are thinking about running for Congress, you have to recognize that if you want to have any influence in Washington, if you want to do your civic duty, you want to spend some time as a congressperson, you go into Washington, you're going to have to be there 10, 12, 15, 20 years to have any real influence. Now that is a significant amount of time. And a lot of good people, I would argue, say, I don't want to spend that much of my life as a politician, and I'm not going to seek office because of it. That is why we have in Congress today, about half of Congress has law degrees. It's a skewed sampling that we have in office. What we need for democracy to work is to have representative democracy. But when you have over 90% men and half attorneys, you don't have representative democracy. You have people in Congress today who are professional politicians, career legislators. This is what they want to do with their life. What we need in Congress are computer programmers, business people, teachers, nurses, people from the community. Particularly in the lower house, that's important. But as I say, a person who has a productive life in the private sector doesn't want to spend 15 years as a politician, so they opt not to run. And the people you get running, I don't mean to say that the people that do run are bad people. I think that they have the best of motives. I remember in 1990, I was at the University of Southern California debating Proposition 140, which was the first very strong state term limit initiative. Actually made Speaker Willie Brown cry when it passed. But I was debating Brown's lieutenant, a fellow named Mike Roos, who was the assistant majority leader in the California Assembly. And at one point, Roos said, "You know, Mr. Crane, I don't know whether you realize what you're doing to me when you promote term limits." He said, I studied public administration when I was in college. I got a master's degree in government. I went to work for a state legislator. Then I eventually ran for the state legislature. I've been a state legislator for 13 years. I've always wanted to be a legislator. This is my career. This is what I want to do, and you're taking it away from me. And I said, Assemblyman Roos, I have no doubt that everything you said is true, that you have always wanted to be a legislator. I said, I have no doubt that when you were in the 4th grade, you were blackboard monitor or whatever else was available at the time. The point is, you are not representative of the private sector, and the legislatures of America, whether they're the state houses or the Congress, should represent society, and society is not government. And so we have what I would call an adverse pre-selection process. We need a different kind of person running for office. And incidentally, in California, where term limits did pass, there's a big increase in the number of people running. Many more women, minorities, people who are not attorneys, much higher percentage are seeking office. So it's working in the one state that's closest to Congress right now. The second reason, besides this getting rid of this adverse pre-selection process, and let me go back just to make sure this point is clear. If we limit the terms of Congress to 3 terms in the lower house, 2 for the upper house, and that's what most of the term limit movement's all about, 6 and 12, then you have a situation where a lot of people won't even stay for 6 years because clearly it's no longer a career. What you want is a citizen legislature. You want people going there who really view their time in office as a leave of absence from their real job. But you'll have a much greater pool of people who will be willing to go because they'll be on the same terms as everybody else. They won't be subject to the whims of some 40-year committee chairman.
Ed, can I ask you to condense the other 2 points a bit, so we can have, and perhaps you can save some of the expanded points for the rebuttal after Vic.
The second point, Dan, is simply that we should minimize the exposure to what I call the culture of ruling. Even if you did have a representative Congress, the best people in Congress, it is corrupt. Power corrupts. It is unnatural to have somebody push a microphone in your face every day, to ask your opinion on everything under the sun. And all the National Taxpayers Union and other groups who track these things say that the longer someone is in Congress, regardless of whether they're conservative or liberal, the bigger spenders they become. I think the best people lose their perspective in this unnatural environment. And then the third thing is this need to create a citizen legislature, particularly in the lower house, where you want it to reflect the common sense of the average American and not to reflect the concept of professional politicians, career legislators. The American people are, for the most part, honest, ethical, hardworking, and very respectful of the Constitution. It's high time that the U.S. Congress reflected those values as well, and I think term limits is the means to bring that about.
Thank you very much. I think we've had a good clear statement of the problem. Now we're going to hear from Victor Kamber, a thoughtful fellow who is in the difficult position of defending the status quo, or let me put it this way, the burden of proof is to reply to the problems. Victor Kamber.
Thank you, Dan. First of all, let me thank Ed for the nice remarks at the opening, and I understand why he suggested that I should debate, and that's mainly because there really aren't a whole lot of other people who are taking this position. It's not that I'm so good at it, it's that you can't find a lot of people who are willing to stand up and defend existing politicians. And I'm not going to either, because frankly, whether the existing politician is good or bad has nothing to do with the issue of term limits. We have term limits today in America. You and I can vote anybody out of office we want to. I don't want you to take away my rights that I have. I don't want you to take away the right to determine for myself as an American voter who is qualified to serve and who is unqualified to serve. When we talk about history, and Dan, or Ed, I guess, used the term that this whole subject goes to antiquity, it belongs in antiquity. It's not something that is current and new, and it speaks to a softness that the American public has for the quick fix. Someone's come up with a kick phrase, a clever phrase called term limits, and we've promised everybody that it's going to cure every evil that exists in Congress. Ed was quick to drop. I mean, it's like I don't beat my wife or he doesn't beat his wife. We're not going to talk about check bouncing. We're not going to talk about the scandals of banking. We're not going to talk about any of those things. But he planted the seed with you. Well, let me assure you, you can't talk about those things because term limits doesn't do anything about those things. If a person's going to bounce a check, whether he's there 1 term or 30 terms, he's going to bounce a check. If there are going to be bank scandals, it's going to be because we have stupid people passing laws, whether they're there for 1 term or 10 terms. There's no basis here for making a decision. If somebody could stand up and show me that through term limits, we are going to elect better, more qualified, more talented, more honest people, then I'd be the one leading the charge for term limits. All you're going to tell me by term limits is we're electing a different face, because that's all that's going to happen. We're not even electing a different philosophy. We're electing a different face. The way and problems with our electoral process, which do need addressing, campaign finance reform, dealing with the whole issue of redistricting and how it's done in this country, term limits doesn't touch. The best example you all here in New York have, frankly, is that recent passing of Congressman Ted Weiss, a wonderful legislator, from my perspective as a progressive or a liberal, with a wonderful track record. When he passed away and there was the process of the nominating process or electoral process that came forward, we didn't have 25 citizens in America who stepped forward from all political spectrums. We had 5, 6, 8 equally progressive or liberal politicians who had created some kind of a track record here, put themselves forward, and one was elected who has probably within 5 percentage points the same kind of a voting record as what we had before. Now, for me, that's wonderful, because I'm a liberal progressive. For a conservative, that may be horrible. The fact is, we changed a face. We didn't change anything else. And term limits will only change a face. When you talk about the Constitution, and the Articles of Confederation and history, Dan was correct. There was a wonderful dialogue of papers between Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Adams. More to the point, Mr. Jefferson was literally one of the only figures in our early history that was for term limits. It was in the Articles of Confederation originally and was brought up for the Constitution and was soundly taken out. There was never even a vote between the delegates in the Constitution because it was so resoundingly felt that it was not compatible to the concepts of a democratic government. Mr. Madison in his Federalist Papers in paper 53 speaks directly to this issue of why term limits would not work for a democratic process. Chief Justice Joseph Story, when he analyzed what the Articles of Confederation had caused and brought about, also discussed eloquently why term limits was in fact not something that was desirous or compatible with the American dream of that time. That's history. The fact is, whether they wanted it or didn't, they didn't put it in the Constitution. When Thomas Jefferson became President of the United States, and I think we know as a president has powers, he never pushed it as something he felt was an agenda item that was important to him. So for all the talk of term limits historically, it wasn't there. Term limits is simply a power grab by the people on the outs who don't know how to get in, who can't get in through the electoral process. It's been financed by a group of fat cat soft Republicans, conservative Republicans over the years, and they'll always bring out the 1 or 2 liberal Democrats who say, gee, I'm for it, like Ralph Nader or like Jerry Brown, and they'll say, see, it's a bipartisan issue. When I debated it with Ralph Nader, Ralph's real honest bottom line was, I just want term limits with a sunset. I want to get rid of the bozos that are there now. I don't want to do it for the future. I don't like the people sitting there now, so let's have term limits. The frustration that the American people have, and I understand that greatly because I equally have it, is with who we're electing. But the fact of term limits will not change that process. Again, it will change the face of who we elect, not the process. We need to deal with campaign finance reform. We need to deal with the other factors that bring people to power. When Ed talks about the support in the country, and let's look at it realistically, and I'll try to do it quickly. He is absolutely right. There's no getting around it. On a flat basis, you go out and take a poll, 60 to 80% of the American people support it. There has been virtually no campaign against it. When I spoke about being the lone voice, I really feel like I am the lone voice out there. In the times when there have been campaigns against it, and California is the prime example. The first time it appeared in California, there were 3 referendas on term limit, 3 initiatives on the ballot. Both sides spent in excess of $2.5 million. Some claim even that my side spent about 4 and Ed's side spent about 2.5 or 3. I don't know the numbers, but certainly $4 to $5, $6 million was spent on both sides of the equation educating the California electorate about this issue. And in fact, when there was an education process, 2 of the 3 term limits went down to defeat on the ballot, and the only one that passed by 1.5%. It did pass, but it passed by 1.5%. The next state that had a major campaign was the state of Washington. And in that campaign, being outspent 2 to 1 by the pro-term limit people, but still spending enough money to get the issue across, the voters of the state of Washington rejected term limits. In this last go-around, with 14 states on the ballot, virtually less than $700,000 was spent in all 14 states collectively to fight this campaign. That's the state of Florida, the state of Ohio, the state of Michigan. I mean, we're talking about in one city in the state of Florida, you couldn't buy with $700,000 any kind of education, let alone educate people. There has been no campaign against it, so it sits in a vacuum, and the American public believes that this will cure rheumatism, cirrhosis of the liver, flat feet, and everything else, because that's what they've been told by the process. The last 2 points that he talks about minimize the ruling, the corruptive process of Washington. Again, I guess I resent that as a citizen. I can determine if I don't like my politician, if that politician has become too corrupt in that process. Again, as an Illinoisan, when I was voting in Illinois, you know, the Paul Douglases of the world to me, or the Paul Simons today, they can sit there as far as I'm concerned until hell freezes over, because they're not the corrupt. I want them there. If I was from Arizona and was a conservative, I'd probably want Barry Goldwater sitting there from now till the end of time, because again, if I believed in what I believed in, I want the right to elect those kinds of people who care about the issues I care about. And lastly, the concept of a citizen legislature. See, I think this is a phony issue. Why do we want a citizen legislature, and why don't we? And if we do, let's elect it. What's the issue of a citizen legislature? If somebody is out of touch with his constituency, then we are going to throw that person out. If somebody's not out of touch with that constituency, I'm not sure electing a banker, a candlestick maker, a plumber makes a difference. I don't know that, you know, the fact, again, throwing the word lawyer is supposed to have some kind of a connotation, because we're all supposed to think evil. Half of them are lawyers. Aha, you know what that means. That's a buzzword for all of you to snicker and laugh. What is a lawyer? So what? Why would those people who probably are the most eligible to make big money in this country be willing to give up that lucrative practice to take the kind of money they get in Congress, especially and sit there their whole lives? The fact is that they're probably doing it because they care about public service. And what's wrong with caring about public service and making that a career? When I go to the hospital, I don't want the new doctor. I want an experienced doctor. When I go to the plumber shop, I don't want the new plumber, the apprentice. I want the experienced plumber. And when I go to my legislator, I don't want the new kid on the block. I want somebody that understands the process, that understands how government works, and can understand how he can help make a difference in my life. We have a problem, and the problem is there is an arrogance. There is an abuse that has taken place, and that comes from the fact that the politicians we elect are not necessarily the quality that we should be electing. That arrogance and that corruption of the process can be changed by electing better people. And that comes not with term limits, but with a more informed electorate, with a more informed and participatory process by people, and with some kind of reforms that levels the playing field between the challenger and the incumbent. And I totally agree with that, and term limits doesn't do it. Thank you.
Friends, I think you will have to concede that we've had two excellent presentations. That's why these fellows are known as the best in their respective fields. So I feel we've done well by you as an audience. Let me ask each of them a question to get the rebuttal discussion going. To Victor, I think it's fair to say that no one would claim that the New York State Legislature is filled only with either Nobel Prize winners or saints. And yet, something like 95% of the incumbents of either party are re-elected as long as they wish to serve. And some of them, we have had some cases of egregious abuse. We've had some cases in our New York State Senate where scandalous types have run unopposed. What defense does the public have?
Well, two things let me answer. Number one, if you believe in democracy, if you truly believe in democracy, if that's who the voters want, don't they deserve that? Are you and I better to sit here and make judgments of who that voter should vote for or should have an elective office? I can complain till I'm blue in the face. I didn't want Ronald Reagan. I didn't want George Bush. But if that's what America wanted, that's what America deserved to have. And frankly, if America wanted Ronald Reagan for 6 terms, they should have him. It's not a choice that you and I arbitrarily should make a judgment of somebody else. Secondly, the facts don't bear out what you're saying. It may in New York. The facts bear out if you look at a 10-year cycle of state legislatures. For example, and I can only throw New York in the category of all state legislatures, 77% turnover of our state legislatures in America happen within every 10-year cycle. If you take Congress, for all the facts, when we all look at the Jamie Whittens who are sitting there serving 50 years, in Congress today, 68% of the House of Representatives have served less than 10 years. 68%. The Senate, over 60% are under 2 terms. People will say, yeah, but it's the last election where we elected so many, so let's not take the last election. Between 1980 and 1990, 60% turnover in the Congress. So we have the turnover, and yes, there are people that stay a long time because that's what the electorate wants or that's what they want. But I believe in the American voter, and if that's what the American voter wants, they deserve to get what they are electing.
Okay, thank you. Ed Crane, what is your reply to the fear frequently expressed that term limits will lose institutional memory? You'll lose the continuity, you'll lose the experience that's been built up on the one hand, and that the real power of the legislature will be turned over to the permanent staff, the faceless, unelected types who really know where the bodies are buried. What is your reply to that charge?
Well, given what these people are remembering inside the Congress, losing our institutional memory would be one of the advantages of term limits. But I think the argument against that we'll lose our experienced legislators is a spurious argument. It was the experienced legislators, for instance, that gave us the budget deal of 1990. Now, that's a budget deal. We're wringing our hands. We've got this big budget crisis, big deficit. We're all going to get together. The people who got together from the House, there were 11 of them that did the negotiating, had an average age of 61. They had, in terms of their careers, 87% of their years cumulative were spent in government or as legislators. What kind of a deal did they strike? There are 4,000 federal domestic programs. In this great budget crisis, not a single one of those programs was eliminated. Not a single federal employee was sacked. And yet the second biggest tax increase in American history was laid on the American people. That's what the experienced legislators gave us. And I say, if that's what they're going to give us, then let's get rid of the experienced legislators and let's get a citizen legislature. Now, the second point that you mentioned, Dan, was the permanent bureaucracy would run things. If that's the case, the Gallup organization did a poll in October, just before the election, and they polled 3 groups inside the Beltway: lobbyists, mid-level federal bureaucrats, and congressional staff. This group, almost 60% of them oppose term limits. Why do they oppose term limits if this is going to be so good for them? You know, you're looking at a concept that 80% of Americans favor, and almost 60% of these groups oppose it. The reason is that at least as far as the lobbyists are concerned, they have a deal over the years they've worked out with these congressmen. The staff gets their power from the power of the congressman. And the bureaucrats have much more trouble with a new congressman coming in thinking he's supposed to represent the people in his district rather than somebody that's learned to get along and go along as the 20, 30, and 40-year congressmen have.
Can I respond?
Yes, please. Let me suggest that before we turn to our audience, to questions from our audience, each of the two of you might want to take just a few minutes to give a summary rebuttal to the comments of the others. So, Victor, do you want to start with a summary?
I'm sure Ed would like to beat up on the whole stuff I said before, but in regard to the last, let me comment on two things. One, again, there's when Ed used the example of the budget, that's an exact example of what term limits won't do. He was honest when he told you his frustration, and he may be right or wrong. I mean, I don't want to argue that legislation before you. We can have that should be a subject of another hour debate here. But the point is, it's not because those 11 people had this great longevity there that we had the legislation. It's because philosophically they differ where he is, and his view is, let's get rid of those 11 people. And since he can't do it electorally, because our process, whether it's an unbalanced process or because these people happen to do a good job of taking care of their citizens back home and their citizens elect them, he's saying let's do it through term limits. But there is absolutely no guarantee that the next 11 won't think exactly the same way. If you could show me that there'd be a difference, then maybe we could have a different discussion on that issue. On the issue of the power brokers, there's absolutely no doubt about who becomes powerful in this process. And in term limits. And it is special interests, and it is the bureaucracy, both federal and the Capitol Hill. Look at who these people have just hired that have just been elected. They didn't bring with them all the citizenry from back home. Every single one to speak of went for the most qualified, the most talented, the persons on the Hill who had the most experience so they could learn where the bathrooms were and how to flush them. These freshmen that are coming, they have to know how to work in this town. And how do you work in this town? You go to the people that know how the town works. And how do you think you get there? If you really believe in term limits, the only true term limit can be one term. You can't have 2 terms or 3. You can only believe in 1 term, because how would somebody get there unless they go to those, with the cost of running today being what it is, unless you go to the special interests of the right or the left and ask for their money, unless you go to the special interests and deal with all the things that it takes. And even if it's a 3-term limit, what makes you think that they won't do all that it takes to get back the 2nd term and the 3rd term? Because they want that process to happen. I represent special interests. Why do my clients, in fact, keep quiet on this? Because they understand, to some extent, they will be more powerful in this process. Why would they be against it? Why in the poll, as he says? Because maybe they believe in the institution of Congress. Maybe they understand the process of government and think, frankly, that this is not a solution to the problems of Congress.
Fine. Thank you. Ed, would you like to give, for just a few minutes, a general rebuttal to the positions that...
I think I just heard Vic say that labor unions would benefit from term limits.
I didn't say labor unions. I said my clients. Some are labor unions.
Thing.
No, I represent a lot of people.
Yeah. Just to correct a few things, Vic mentioned that only Thomas Jefferson supported term limits. John Adams, George Mason, George Washington, and Ben Franklin, to mention a few other reasonably notable people.
But Ed, they didn't push it in the Constitution.
Well, the Constitution was not supposed to be a detailed document. It was supposed to lay out broad principles, and they viewed that as too detailed. You mentioned that in the campaign there hasn't been a really high-level funded campaign against term limits. Well, Willie Brown in California got every special interest in the state to come up with a $6 million budget. If you look at the campaign finance reports, the opposition was about $1 million, not $2.5 million. And the fact is that because there were multiple term limit initiatives on the ballot, that hurt the vote of the top one. So people had favorites. It split the vote, and still it won. So I think that the most highly publicized term limit debate went clearly in favor of those who support term limits. Vic mentioned that we'll have a different face, not a different philosophy if we have term limits. I think we'll have something else, though. We'll have a different attitude. We'll have a little more humility. I mean, why is everybody inside the Beltway so strongly opposed to term limits if nothing's going to change but the faces? Something else is going to change. Let me give you just a kind of a thought game. Assume you got 535 people randomly selected from the United States, put them in a room and said, look, here's the deal. We're going to deregulate the thrifts in America. Let them invest in anything. It's a competitive world market. You say, well, yeah, that's okay. Let them invest in anything. Except that if their investments go bad, we're going to have the American taxpayer underwrite it. That 535 citizen legislators would say that's crazy, I would guess. I would argue. They would say, that's a license to speculate. That's ridiculous. And yet, Congress did just that. They have, with their massive federal deposit insurance scheme that allows multimillionaires to have millions and millions of dollars secured by the American taxpayer, they put their money where the rate of return is the highest, and those are the most speculative institutions. Only Congress could create a situation. These people have been there so long, they think they can repeal the laws of economics.
Okay, thank you. We're now going to turn it open to general questions, which I hope will be brief, and I hope your answers will be brief so we can cover a lot of ground. I think we've all learned a lot. Ed, I have to confess, one thing I learned was that your institution, the Cato Institute, was named after the Cato letters. I'm disappointed. I always thought it was named after Cato the Elder, the Roman general and legislator who was a favorite of mine. Cato the Elder it was once proposed that there be a statue of him in the Roman Forum, and he turned it down, saying he'd rather have people ask why there wasn't a statue than why there was. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we had men of legislators of such modesty and a sense of reality today? But I'm going to have to go back and reread the Cato letters.
That's very, very interesting.
Now, let us take our speakers. First one, Stanley,
Yes.
can you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm
And-
Stanley Turkel, the elder, and I have this question for both speakers today. It is not easy to imagine how government can be improved by promoting the virtues of inexperience and by arbitrarily limiting this period of service for members whose legislative concerns may require longer-term attention. Many complex legislative initiatives require years to develop and steer through Congress. Moreover, Congress must also oversee administration of laws by the executive branch. The result of term limits will get us a rotation of rookies who won't know the ropes. Won't that give more power to lobbyists who are not term limited?
Well, of course, as I mentioned before, lobbyists are opposed to term limits as a group. We want experience in Congress. I think the proponents of term limits want experience in Congress because Congress is supposed to represent the American people. But you want experience in living in the real world, not experience in running other people's lives. There's a distinction between that kind of experience. George McGovern recently had a piece in the Wall Street Journal where he discussed the fact that he'd been in public life all his life until he lost the presidency, the race for the presidency, and then he then went out and bought a hotel restaurant complex, I believe, in Connecticut. And he was amazed at how much red tape there was and how high taxes were and how difficult it was to make a living. The hotel eventually went bankrupt. He had the wrong kind of experience. He was going to pass laws and presume to tell Americans how they should live, and he didn't have a clue how the private sector actually worked. Term limits will bring people in who have experience in living in the real world.
Okay.
The facts are it does not. The most recent election process tells us that. When we look at the chance for citizens to become legislators, whatever reason it happened, this year we had about 150 competitive races out there between the large number of retirements and between the scandals that took place in Congress. The fact is that the citizens that Ed would like to see run didn't run, and other politicians ran from other offices. So we're not going to get necessarily what he's asking for, and I'm not sure it matters what he's asking for, whether they'll impact the process. I think the question really answered itself in that the issues of today have become extremely complex. To talk about our defense posture and to talk about now the whole peace dividends and how to deal with them, what projects we should be spending money on, what bases we should be closing, to talk about the tax structure in the country, to talk about a whole series of issues that frankly take years of study, years of time. If you elect new people, and they could be all geniuses, the fact is they will rely on the talents of the expertise who's in that town, whether it's staffers, whether it's the bureaucracy of federal government, or whether it's the lobbyists who they depend on for their money and for their information, because those will be the experts that they will go to since they lack that expertise.
Okay, thank you. Yes, sir. Henry Stern.
Yeah. Well, I want to say that both speakers were excellent.
So can you introduce
Yeah,
yourself?
my name is Henry Stern. The younger, used to be. At any rate, both speakers were terrific, and each one persuaded me in turn. And then the rebuttals only made it more confusing. The problem is this, and I've just reminded, there's a local legislator here who either represents this block in the State Assembly or one of a few blocks west, who was elected at 23, who's not going any higher, who's a very nice fellow. But do we deserve 50 years of this fine fellow? Now, on the issues, you say, Mr. Kamber, that we need reform, campaign financing reform, all the rest of it, but all these things, and I've worked for them in civic organizations, have been defeated time after time by the lifetime legislators.
That's not correct.
And why should they? No, we don't have real campaign financing at the federal level. We've suffered defeat after defeat in the state legislature. We have a law in New York City, which is to some extent working. But the point is, the people who are in will not reform themselves. I look at term limits as a kind of capital punishment for legislators. And yes, my question is to both or either, what chance is there that these people will reform themselves without the sword of removal hanging over their heads?
In the last Congress, we passed a campaign finance reform bill. The same people that dominated this country for the last whatever number of years, the Democrats passed it, and it was vetoed by a Republican president. It was a power issue, and that's what we're dealing with here. It is power, but it's political power, party power. Term limits, again, I will say to you, may change. If you don't like the 50-year sitting member here, then you should, and you probably do, work the blocks to get rid of them. But I mean, there is an electoral process we have. The term limits do not guarantee you campaign finance reform. The new batch of members, and Ed will say, well, they're more inclined because they have less reason. We don't know that. We don't know what they're going to do. The fact is, the campaign finances reforms we've passed have become basically grown out of scandal and problems. If the amount of attention and effort that this movement has put in term limits focused on campaign finance reform, we'd get it. Because if that's what the public wants, the Congress would react to it, frankly.
Okay. Ed, did you want to have? Yes, sir.
My name is Milton Kirchman. In connection with term limitation, could you explain the logic for having a congressman elected for a 2-year term, a senator for a 6-year term, and a Supreme Court justice for his entire lifetime?
Well, our forefathers felt that the Congress should be as reflective of the district as possible, and the best way to be reflective was to have that person go back to the voter every 2 years and stand for election. And the fact is that as the moods and the winds of life changed, that legislator would be thrown out of office or reelected depending upon the view. The 6 years was so that those people did not have to bend to every whim and wish that was taking place, every mood in the country that was taking place. Plus, the 6 years was put into effect at that time by the people who wrote the Constitution who wanted those jobs. The Supreme Court was to create a system that was supposedly totally non-political, that was free of the political process and the whims and wishes of people, where jurists could sit and make judgments based upon legal scholarly views. Whether that's real or not, I think those were the judgments. Ed may just...
No, I think Vic's right on that, and I do think it's worth pointing out that the Senate was always viewed to be the more deliberative of the two bodies, and that the House should be more representative of the average American, and that is why we favor 3 terms for the House, 6 years, and 2 terms for the Senate, which is 12 years, so that it would be quite likely that a senator would have spent 18 years in Congress by the time his term limitations were up, which is not a unduly strict limitation. There are some 500 to 600,000 people in each congressional district. The idea that that you can only need one person to serve during 20 or 30 years is itself kind of an insult to democracy. There are plenty of people, good, intelligent people, who would be more civic-minded if they thought there would be an opportunity. And you know, the term limits also affords a tremendous opportunity for women and minorities. There were 24 new women voted into Congress in this past election. 21 of them came from open seats. So it is the whole status quo is defended by the incumbency right now.
That didn't happen because of a term limits. It happened because of a mood in the country that's taken place. This district we're sitting in right now elected a woman against a very wealthy, well-entrenched Republican who was sitting here and with no scandal on his name. The fact was there was a mood in this country to bring women into power, and the fact that only 21 or 24 won is still an insult to the process. There should be 50% of that Congress that are women, and that'll only happen when we change the process and make it more balanced.
Why did 21 out of 24 come in open seats? Is that just a coincidence?
Yes, I think it is. Absolutely.
Okay, excuse me. Yes, sir.
Kevin Farrelly. It's always been my thought that the thirst for term limits is just part of a much broader problem, and that is the problem that people feel disconnected from their representatives. And one of the reasons for that is the size of the districts. When 200 years ago, a member of the House of Representatives represented 60,000 people, that same representative now represents 570,000 people. A city council district now consists of roughly 144,000 people. That's 2.5 times the size of the original House districts 200 years ago. Do you think there should be any movement towards decreasing the size of the districts, which of course would mean more representatives in whatever body we're talking about? Would that help solve some of the problems?
I'm certainly in favor of that. I agree that that is a real problem, and I think that a larger House would be a more representative House and more likely to be a citizen legislature.
No, I disagree totally. And first of all, I disagree with the premise. The fact is, the voter is not I didn't know how you put the word, estranged or disconnected from his own representative. The numbers show just the opposite. The voter likes their own member. The voter doesn't like the institution of Congress and the other's member. It's not their own member. The fact is the numbers show we keep re-electing our own, and we like our own. It's we don't like the next districts and the whole institution of Congress, and that has nothing to do with size.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
David Kornblue. I have a question for Mr. Rose. Mr. Rose, would you favor term limitations for corporate executives?
Yes, I think as a practical matter, although as moderator I'm not supposed to show my bias, so that I really shouldn't answer that question. The reference was made to the exchange of letters between Jefferson and Adams, and Jefferson's comment was, in general, there's more to be gained by the freshness and the vigor and the open-mindedness of the incomer than there is to be lost by the experience and wisdom, accumulated knowledge of the older. And I think that might be, at a certain point, that might be true in life generally. However, I am, as moderator, I will not make any further comment. Thank you.
My name is Henry Heimoff. One question, I'm not certain, maybe the question would be, would the power of the lobbyists, the professionals who've been around forever, be enhanced or reduced by term limitations? I mean, there's one specific, publicized matter. For example, Tom Donlin in the November 30th Barron's, in the editorial page, he pointed out that because of all of the changes that have been introduced, corporations spend $192 billion to calculate the $110 billion they actually spend in corporate income taxes. So he endorsed an idea of mine. He said, simplify the tax code, collect the $192 billion, and you wipe out the budget deficit. I talked to Rick Wertzman, who does this for the Wall Street Journal, and he said you can't get it through. This is the...
We're running out
Okay.
of time, so...
Whether he can't get it through because the lobbyists make all their money out of this kind of complex legislation. Would this term limitations make this kind of situation
Question is, what would
improved?
the de facto effect be on, of term limitations on the power of special interests and lobbyists?
And using this example...
Well, yeah, I think a term-limited Congress would be much more difficult for lobbyists to control because they wouldn't have the long-term relationships, work out the mutual back-scratching deals, and they'd also be much less likely to put a lot of money and investment into a congressman who's only going to be there 6 years rather than 40 years. So that explains right there why corporate lobbyists oppose term limits.
Just the opposite. The fact is, if you look at the 150 races that were competitive this year, more money was spent in those 150 races because they were competitive. More special interests poured money on both sides of the aisle to elect their friends. And that will continue. If there's an open seat, the special interests are going to try, until you change campaign finance reform and get rid of the special interests, they're going to have that clout and that power. And that's the crazy way to think of this. It's not going to change with term limits. It's going to change with campaign finance reform.
Well, friends, I'm afraid we're running out of time. We're grateful to our two speakers who I think have done a formidably effective job of presenting their positions. We want to remind our audience that this is one of a continuing series of our regular Friday luncheons. The food is good, the company is good, the conversation is good, the speakers are good, and come to join us at the City Club Friday luncheons.
Thank you, Dan Rose. And a hand for the moderator now, Dan Rose.
Thank you.
Well, hello everyone and welcome to the City Club. My name is Ed Tristram. I'm the president of the City Club of New York, and I'm your host here at our weekly Friday Forum luncheons. City Club has been doing this for quite a while, but not as long as we've been around. The City Club is 102 years old, the oldest civic organization in New York City. You're invited and you are welcome to join us. Give us a call at 921-9870 to attend one of these events. They're mostly held at 33 West 42nd Street at the CUNY Graduate Center. Today's program is about the New York City budget. Sally Goodgold, the chair of the City Club, points out that the budget is really the master plan for New York City in a very real sense. It's an enormous document. It's a political document. It's not very well understood. Today we have three of the foremost experts in the field, and one is our moderator, two are our speakers. So I'll introduce the moderator, Catherine Woodard. Catherine Woodard has been writing for Newsday and New York Newsday since 1984. She's from Carolina. She's a Carolina transplant. The reason that would seem pretty easy to remember. Why did I bring notes up here? To remember the awards. She received the Deadline Club Award for her property tax assessment series, Long Island Press Club for local government coverage, New York Newspaper Publishers Association Award for AIDS coverage. And last year, again, the Deadline Club Public Service Award for her service on tuberculosis. So please welcome our moderator, Catherine Woodard.
Thank you. It's, as we've already talked about, city budgets aren't spreadsheets. They are political documents. But it's always the most revealing document for any mayor. This is going to be the budget Mayor Rudolph Giuliani proposes May 10th is going to be the best look yet at what he actually intends to do in the city. Because it's one thing to, in the campaign, it's easy to talk about things that you would like to do and things that you would like to avoid. But when you have to put the budget out there, that is exactly how your vision of running the city. And we have two speakers who are going to talk about their view of what should be done and what should not be done. And first will be Penelope Pinsounier, who is the Executive Director of the City Project. And the City Project is a not-for-profit organization looking at policy decisions in the city, particularly budget and health policy, health and human services. She has a BA from Radcliffe and a Master's in Social Work from Boston University.
Excuse me, could you just put the mic a little closer?
Surely.
Thank you.
Following her will be Charles Brescher, Director of Research for the Citizens Budget Commission. He's also a professor of Health and Public Administration at NYU's Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. And he has a degree from University of Florida and a PhD in political science from the Graduate Division of the City University of New York. Penelope, you want to get us started here?
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here and give what we've got as a cut on what's happening in this budget. A little bit more word on the City Project Alter Budget. We are a broad-based membership organization with nonprofit municipal service providers, civic groups, arts groups, open space groups, really across the whole city. And we do work trying to analyze budgets, and that's presumably why I'm here today, and educating budgets. I'm glad to hear someone use the word here today, demystifying budgets that we all really can understand, must understand, because that's where policy gets translated into rhetoric gets translated into reality, we hope, and we do some advocacy work. Looking at this budget as best we can at this point, I would say as a starter that there is certainly lots of room for improving the government of New York City and its delivery of services. There is room for reinventing it, as it's called today, reorganizing it, making it more effective in meeting the needs of its businesses, residents, and visitors. Unfortunately, we at City Project and Alter Budget see Mayor Giuliani's reinvention as reducing government, not just in its size and number of employees, but in the kinds and functions and responsibility it accepts as its duty to perform. In analyzing the financial plan and developments since February, it becomes clear that the mayor wants government not just to be more efficient, something we all support and want clearly, but to get out of the business of providing a wide range of services that New York City has traditionally provided. The financial plan is built, I think, on several very shaky assumptions. First, that New York City can get rid of 15,000, 17,000, 30,000 employees over 14 months without hurting services and without hurting neighborhoods, including the neighborhoods where many of the employees who will be laid off or downsized spend their salaries after they've been paid. The second is that we can freeze the city's major tax bases, property tax, personal income tax, and corporate income taxes, and balance the budget and not hurt services. The third assumption is that we can promote economic growth even with major disinvestments in the city's physical and human infrastructures, transit, education, housing, youth, parks, the arts, lots of different infrastructures. The City Project's analysis of the mayor's plan leads us to disbelieve many of the mayor's stated goals. As Catherine was saying, what you say in campaigns, what you keep saying, and how you act them out. If the goal of the plan of this mayor is to lower the cost of city government, four things, I say, would be different. First, the cuts would be directed at specific programs and costs rather than at heads. Why 17,000, not 10,000 or 19,000 heads? 10 heads at $20,000 apiece create very different savings than 10 heads at $50,000 apiece. Second, the cuts would be distributed more evenly by exempting over half the city's workforce in police, fire, and teachers, and minimally touching others. 1/3 of the total workforce in DSS, the Department of Social Services, in the Department of Health, the Department of Homeless Services, have to take all and non-pedagogical workers at the Board of Education who are lumped together under administration, but are also cafeteria workers, school crossing guards, people who I would not call administrative. These people have to take all the cuts. As it is in the plan with the first stages of headcount reductions, the Department of Social Services will be asked to take somewhere between a 20 and 27% headcount reduction and still deliver services. The Department of Homeless Services will be asked to take somewhere between 23 and 31% cut and still perform services. And it must be recognized, too, that the majority of these workers are African American and Latino. Third, the targeted heads would not include heads funded with federal, or would not, sorry, if this were his true goal, then I say that the targeted heads would not include heads funded with federal and state matches, where $1 saved, quote unquote, loses the city probably from $1 to $3 in non-city money. A huge percentage of the workforce in the Department of Social Services, where average salaries are already low, are threatened. And also in the Department of Health, both these agencies are funded with matching funds which are threatened. Child welfare and Ryan White AIDS funding are 2 cases in point. And fourth, the costs of not paying for preventive investments in housing, anti-eviction programs, youth, home care for seniors would be weighed in. I call them front door investments as versus backdoor investments of shelters, which cost you $30,000 a family, or jails, which cost you $58,000 a year for an individual. You have to count those costs in when you say you're saving costs. The next goal, if productivity is the goal of this budget, then every department, including the police and fire departments, would be asked to pitch in. Instead, they are exempted. The CBC, who will be talking after me, has identified $265 million in savings that could be achieved without hurting public safety, and that it could enhance the number of officers on street patrol through civilianization, reducing wash-up time by 20 minutes a shift, and other savings. The city project has identified just a few of the ways that this money could be better invested, and together with Chuck Brescher, we put together a piece in New York Newsday Forum identifying where the savings could come and identifying where some of the services could be enhanced and made better. I simply cannot accept the mayor's argument that demands on police will, quote, hurt their morale. Cuts won't hurt the morale of the caseworkers whose already overwhelming caseloads will go up yet further and who lose backup supervision and training and have a tremendous turnover rate already. Or his other argument that the police put their lives on the line for us every day. Yes, they do, and we owe them a lot for doing that. But what about the child protective workers who go into volatile, dangerous situations every day, investigating reports of abuse? That, too, lives on the line. And then, if economic development and the creation of jobs is the goal, then the mayor would not disinvest in the city's infrastructures. Stanley Bresnoff, the executive director of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, says it's very simple. Infrastructure, infrastructure, and infrastructure. Over and over, he says it loudly, clearly, and repeatedly. Lou Rudin agrees. Business cries out for it over and over, for subways that get workers to work on time, schools that educate our kids instead of falling down on their heads, youth that are prepared for the workforce that we need to have. Economic development will require a much more comprehensive strategy than simply cutting taxes and letting the market take care of the jobs. And lastly, if the goal is to privatize government through contracting out services, then the contract budget, which is in the budget plan, would not be flat for 4 years. Nonprofit service providers should not think that services cut with government workers will be then shifted automatically into new contracts. Unfortunately, this issue pits non-service service providers against municipal providers when they're all trying to provide much the same services. No, these are not the true goals. The real goal, I fear, is to downsize the responsibilities of government, to dismantle particular parts of government, the parts that provide services primarily to low-income and other vulnerable New Yorkers. Certainly, poor communities and communities of color will suffer the most. We have to ask ourselves about our commitment to our common weal, to use a rather 18th century term, to our old-fashioned notion of democracy and a social contract, and to fairly shared benefits and sacrifices. The sacrifices are simply not shared fairly in this plan. A few examples illustrate this myth, this reality. In the Department of Aging, 20,000 fewer home care hours where there is already a waiting list of over 2,000 people, and the cost of nursing home care is $84,000 a year. In health, cuts to maternity service where $1,000 can prevent up to $400,000 in low-weight births. Cuts to TB, which threaten all of us. And to lead poisoning prevention, where right now there are 131 claims on file, and the city recently had to pay $1.9 million in one claim. And AIDS, that's been well publicized. The proposed cuts to the Department of AIDS services would save $9 million, they admit, and threaten the loss of $45 to $100 million in Ryan White and other funding coming to the city. In housing, the community consultant program is to be cut by 35% to save $1 million, but result in more evictions, which results in more homeless people, which results in more shelters. In social services, the cuts in the child welfare preventive housing subsidies will mean more kids go into foster care at $40 a day as versus $10 a day in preventive actions. The proposal to eliminate $200,000 in food stamp outreach will lose $200,000 in the federal matching grant and potentially lose $7.7 million coming into the city in the way of food stamps for people to spend in the city's economy. In the parks, further cuts threaten further deterioration of the quality of life for all New Yorkers and further increase in an already high incidence of liability from playground and other injuries. We say there are some alternatives that the mayor continues to reject. First, the council has offered some very real alternatives, from consolidation of various city agencies to selling off some city assets. Many of them merit serious exploration. Many of them we don't agree with, but they should nonetheless be given serious consideration. As with the mayor's proposals to privatize, the council's proposals to privatize must be examined on certain principles, certain criteria: the quality of services that will be provided, the cost effectiveness of those services, and for their accessibility and affordability to the people that need them. Will privatizing meet those standards? Secondly, the Citizens Budget Commission, and Chuck will be talking about it, with City Project, Alter Budget, and others now, are pressing for savings, as I've been getting at here, from the police and fire departments. Even the CBC has been brushed aside with others of their ilk and called inflexible. Third, New York City should move now to reform and raise revenue from its property tax. The Commission on Real Property Tax Reform failed in its mandate last December to present recommendations for reform, but it did further clarify the enormous inequities of the current structure. Co-ops and condominiums now pay 2 to 3 times the rate for their taxes as do single-family homeowners. Renters, who very often don't realize that they pay property tax, pay up to 6 times more. It's just plain not fair, and it's getting worse. We urge the mayor and the council to start a phased-in reform now, weighted toward Class 1, and not, as the council is proposing, by reducing the rate on co-ops and condominiums, which would lose the city another $44 million in the first year and $444 million by the 10th year, a loss which the city can ill afford. And last, no, not quite lastly, fourth, I would say reduce the out-year gaps by rescinding the out-year tax cuts that are built into this budget, particularly the personal income tax reduction, a loss to the city of some $400 million plus, again, which they can't afford, and half of which would go to households earning over $150,000. Those are people who at this point in this budget are not being asked to sacrifice. Why should they get yet another benefit? And lastly, I would put in a pitch and advocate for the Independent Budget Office. And I'm very glad that the City Club has been very helpful and is pushing for this one also. The Independent Budget Office was written into the charter. It is charter mandated. It is now 3 times court mandated. It has to be established and funded in this budget. Thank you.
Chuck?
Thanks. Well, let me begin by taking a minute also to describe the organization. I'm here representing the Citizens Budget Commission. For those of you who might not be familiar with it, it is an independent, nonprofit, nonpartisan organization run by a board of about 140 trustees drawn from different components of the business and nonprofit community in New York City. It's been in existence since 1932, and its core values are really around its middle name, that is budget. It's committed to balancing budgets, that is being sure that both the state and the city budgets are balanced and avoiding the kind of gimmickry that often passes costs from the present to the future but increases those costs in doing so. So we first have a standard that budgets ought to be balanced. Second, we are for efficiency in service delivery. That is, that the government ought to take seriously the responsibility of performing those functions that it legitimately performs and doing them in a way that makes the best use of the taxpayers' funds. So we've been concerned with developing ideas for helping people in government perform those functions more efficiently, and we've tried to apply that to a broad spectrum of services, whether it be the Human Resources Administration or the Police Department or the Fire Department. We try to say, let's see if we can't deliver this service in the most effective way and find opportunities to increase efficiency. So those are the kinds of things that we're concerned with. Let me focus now on the budget, which we're talking about, which really the budget cycles run for more than a year in the sense that we start talking about a budget in February when the mayor releases a preliminary plan. We do an executive budget in April or delay it to May, depending on what's happening in Albany. And then a budget is adopted and implemented throughout the year. We're in a kind of an early midpoint of that cycle, but we ought to go back to February and think about the context for this budget, and some of the very hard things that Penelope was describing really have to be seen in the context of this being a very tough budget year. The city has gone through since 1988, 1989, a big contraction in its economy that has taken away resources. That's a hard fact that we need to deal with. There's about over 300,000 jobs that disappeared from the city's economy in the 1989 to 1993 period. That's, you know, if that were some other place, we're talking about probably something the equivalent of the city of Boston disappearing. But that happened within the 5 boroughs. But it means that a lot of income and tax base that was here isn't here, and you need a budget within that context. It means that the property values, with 40% of the local revenues coming from the property tax, property values were down. We had actual decreases in the assessed value of property here, something that hadn't happened since the low point of the mid-1970s. So the resources have shrunk, and that affects what you can do in a budget, because you can't spend money you don't have. At the same time, spending pressures were increasing. The fact that the economy was shrinking did not mean that public assistance and Medicaid costs were going down. In fact, the opposite was true. They were going up. Healthcare costs plus national mandates and requirements were increasing Medicaid at rates in double digits, in 11 to 14% roughly is what Medicaid costs increase. We now spend in local dollars about $2 billion on Medicaid in the budget. And then, because we had serious infrastructure needs that had been neglected, there was a very large capital program that was put in place in the 1980s. Capital spending was vastly accelerated from almost nothing at the peak, the trough of the fiscal crisis, to up to around $3 billion a year or so in the late 1980s. Now, that isn't money you spend today out of the operating budget. It's capital money you borrow. But what that means is as you start to pay back those bonds, the debt service in the operating budget goes up. So at the same time that the economy was suddenly going down, the debt service from all of the borrowing that had taken place through the 80s for very legitimate purposes in terms of investment and infrastructure was going up. So the budget is being squeezed by declining revenues and these pressures that don't go away. So there's have to be focused on relatively small parts of the budget, relatively small, but not all of the budget, when you think about how you're going to bring it into balance. And that's part of why the emphasis on looking at the payroll, because about half the city's budget is expenditures for employees, and it's the part that's not represented by the things I was just describing, the mandated public assistance and Medicaid expenditures and the debt service. So the budget that we're talking about takes place in this very tough times when you go to quantify it, put a number on it, we're talking about a gap of $2.3 billion that doesn't go away. You're going to have to basically shrink expenditures because more taxes has been seen as economically destructive. You can go after state aid, which I want to talk about a little bit. But we've got a $2.3 billion hole to fill, and that's the magnitude of the problem, and it's big by absolute standards and historical standards. So in that context, I'd say that the mayor's plan in February was a very serious effort to try and address that. It did things that had not been addressed seriously before. I think the budget year we're in now comes from a budget that was framed in an election year. It had a lot of one-shot items in it that did not address the future gaps. And the mayor's plan did take a long-run look and say, what are we going to have to do to deal with this $2.3 billion gap that grows in subsequent years? And it did a number of things that we at CBC had been concerned with as being necessary. One of which was substantial workforce reductions. It is inevitable that you have to focus on the workforce as a way to bring the budget into balance. So it made a commitment to reduce by a little over 15,000 the number of workers by the end of the next fiscal year, including 7,600 which were to be cut before the end of June through the so-called severance program, that is, giving enticements for people to leave. It made a strategic calculation and an emphasis to go for more state aid by going after an assumption of Medicaid costs, phasing that in, producing over $200 million this year, but growing ultimately to a full state assumption towards the end of the century. It made consolidations and efficiencies. It looked for overtime reductions. It also went after increased state aid for cities, better state payment for people in city jails who are actually responsibilities of the state but are being held in city jails. Went after efficiencies in the sanitation department, either by extending routes or, if that could not be achieved through bargaining with the union, by saying we would begin to privatize collection routes. Went after those kinds of efficiencies in the sanitation department and proposed civilianizing positions in the Department of Corrections, another way of gaining efficiencies. You replace uniformed personnel with civilian personnel, it costs less. So if you don't need a uniformed person doing that job, don't use them for that. So those were all things that we saw as serious efforts to deal with the problem, things that were consistent with an agenda that people who wanted balanced budget and wanted efficiency could applaud. But we are a watchdog organization, and we do have concerns, and I would not say that we were 100% satisfied with what was presented. So in talking about the mayor's plan, because we don't yet have the executive budget, this forum was initially scheduled to follow what was the initial release. We're now going to precede it by about 10 days or so. But in dealing with the plan, I would say there are two kinds of points I'd like to make that we can say at this point. One is that it has some things that are bad policy. I mean, what I outlined was some of the things I consider good policy that ought to be supported. There are a few things that I would label bad policy in there that ought to be changed. Secondly, there are some things in there, both on the good and the bad side, that probably aren't going to materialize, which means that a preliminary plan that was able to balance the budget, it's not now self-evident that that's going to work. And there's going to be a remaining hole that we're all going to be very curious to see how it's filled when that budget comes, the executive budget comes out on May 10th. But let me talk about the things that I don't think are good policy that were in that plan. Three items I want to focus on. One is actually a carryover from the Dinkins administration that the mayor has incorporated in his planning. It was a proposal to what is now phrased as sell property tax receivables. That is, it's selling this year to a bank or to whoever decides to purchase the paper that underlies it, the right to collect taxes next year. It is, had it been a deficit note that simply said we want to borrow against next year's taxes, had it just been a borrowing, it would have been illegal, and it would have been brought in the Financial Control Board. It is, in virtually all aspects, the equivalent of a deficit note. It's been structured as an asset sale by, lawyers are clever, as I'm sure some of you know, and it has been structured that way. It functions as drawing on next year's revenues this year. It was proposed by Mayor Dinkins in the budget last year because he had a tight budget. He was looking for ways, these kinds of one-shots. It didn't make sense then. It makes even less sense now because they're projecting a surplus that's bigger than the borrowing. So in effect, it's borrowing now to have money to roll over to spend next year. So that's one piece that's worth $215 million that is just going to pass costs on. You've got to repeat it every year. You've got to do this. You've got to sell next year's revenue again next year to keep it up, or you take a hit in the budget. So that's one piece that shouldn't be there. Another thing he proposed for next year that was worth about $200 million in the plan was what's been called the pension restart. Essentially what that comes down to is that the returns that city pension funds have been earning over the last few years have been greater than what the assumptions are when they decide what the contributions ought to be. Now that happens often. And there are a set of rules that say you look at a rolling average and you then adjust based on what's actually happened to what your experience has been. What the restart does is say, let's sort of not look at the rolling average anymore. Let's start over. And we'll just put in a new assumption and then start the rolling average over again. That's sort of where the restart phrase comes from. And so you can bring down the amount of the contribution much quicker than if you follow this sort of rolling average approach. It's monkeying with pension fund assumptions to help balance budgets. It's probably not a prudent thing to do. I think the city actuary is going to resist doing it, so it may well not happen, but it certainly was not a piece of good policy that was put in this budget. And then the third piece is the one that Penelope noted before, that in thinking about how to reinvent, reduce, make more efficient and effective government, the mayor essentially exempted the police and the fire department. He said, he was in effect saying, there's no way to make those departments more efficient. I'm not going to look to them for any savings in payroll, any fundamental changes in how to make them operate more efficiently. And given that studies that we had done, proposals that others had made, including proposals that other administrations had put forth in collective bargaining, that could achieve that, could deliver a police department that was equally, if not more effective, that put as many, if not more police on the street, it just didn't make sense to do those kinds of exemptions in the context of this budget with that kind of $2.3 billion hole to fill. So there are a number of proposals that have been put forward. The piece that was distributed has some of them. With respect to the police department, we've been particularly focusing on two things that would put more cops on the street and cost less money. And it seems hard to think of why you wouldn't want to do that. And you get into these sort of strange arguments about, well, we don't want to hurt morale. A former budget director who served for a number of years once said the only thing that you always know is true when you talk about the police department budget is that the police commissioner will say police morale is at an all-time low. And it's sort of, I think there's a lot of truth to that, or at least as a criticism of the defense. But the fact is there are two important ways that we could put more police on the street to save money, or at least keep the same number of police on the street as the mayor's goal is. One is civilianization. There had been, when the Safe Streets, Safe City program was put forward, part of that plan was to civilianize and to transfer officers from desk jobs to the street. And the police department identified, I think, over 1,000 positions that they intended to civilianize. This was not outsiders, this was the police department itself, saying we ought to civilianize these jobs. They partially implemented that, but they stopped implementing it because they said the budget division didn't give them the money to hire the civilians. Okay? So what they said was, if you put a civilian hiring freeze on, we can't civilianize, which was true. And it was not the right thing to do. But even worse than that, they, in addition to not civilianizing those positions, what also happened when money wasn't put forward to hire civilians and there was civilian attrition in the police department, the police department backfilled civilian positions. They took officers and said, when a civilian left, that's a necessary function, we'll assign an officer to it. So there were about over 1,000 positions in the roughly 1992, current to now period that were backfilled with officers. So there's now in the police department what we count as 1,481 civilian positions being filled by officers. Right? If you civilianize those positions, you can move the officers onto enforcement duty, replace them with civilians, you save money. Right? You save money by not hiring the police. The argument against doing this has been that if you spend the money for the civilians, the only way you really get the savings is by not hiring the police. So the mayor is in effect taking the position that we can't alter the number of police on the payroll. Not concerned with the number of police on the street, concerned with the number of police on the payroll. But if you're concerned with police on the street, which is what I think most citizens are, civilianization makes sense. The other piece of this is not something the mayor could do unilaterally. It would involve some collective bargaining. But the way in which police officers now work is that they are supposed to appear 243 times a year, 243 tours, for tours of duty that are 8 hours and 35 minutes. And 8 hours of that is on patrol, and 35 minutes is for before and after time. We've gotten a lot of heat from the mayor and the police commissioner because on some occasions this has been referred to as wash-up time. And it's been made quite clear that the police don't wash up in this time. Okay? There's a phrase that captures getting ready for and coming back from the 8 hours on tour. The intention when this was bargained, and it was bargained from what previously was 253 tours of 8 hours and 15 minutes. So the extra 20 minutes was supposed to be devoted to either briefings or training that made the officers more effective when they were out on duty for the other 8 hours. There's a lot of question as to whether that's happened and exactly how that 20 minutes is used and whether it's really making the police more effective. So if one could bargain back those tours, those extra 10 tours a year, that's the equivalent of 1,815 officers. And you would not have to hire officers and have cops on the street for that period of time. So those are the kind of things that we think ought to be examined, that the police department shouldn't be exempt, and we ought to be looking for efficiencies there, and there are others I could describe in the fire department if somebody wants to ask me about it.
Well, just remind everyone as questioners are lining up around this side to speak to our panel, ask questions. You're listening to the City Club Forum program. The audience is invited to join us at 33 West 42nd Street. Give us a call and make a reservation. Our phone number is 921-9870. I'll turn the program back to Catherine Woodard.
let's have a question.
I'm Joseph Rosenblatt, and I wanted to ask the Citizens Budget Committee representative. You didn't make any comment one way or the other on the possible changing of real estate taxes or adding on a fair equivalent for single-family homeowners. How do you regard that point?
The current classification system, I think, is highly inequitable. It imposes much higher rates on the commercial property than the 1, 2, and 3 family homes. And we ought to be, it doesn't make economic sense. I don't think it's very equitable in terms of the way different kinds of residents get treated. So we've been supporting property tax reform that hasn't been happening. But I think moving towards equalization of rates among classes of property makes a lot of sense.
Thank you.
Economically, but hard politically.
My name is Norma Hart. My question is for Ms. Pisunier about the mention you made of, which was not addressed by, at least as we heard, by the Citizens Budget Commission, of the cuts being inequitably distributed among job categories in the Board of Education. And apparently the feeling was that teachers should be included. And if that's not the case, I hope you'll say so, because I think the effect on poor minority children of larger class size would be something
Absolutely.
you would
No,
not approve.
I would agree that teachers should be exempted in numbers, that already our classrooms are too large. We're getting 20,000 new children per year into the school system. Obviously, we're going to have to hire more teachers, but I think that's also part of what Chuck was talking about, the recognition that our needs are going up and that we can't, therefore, just keep saying cut, 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 and making our tax system flat and then expecting to take care of these needs, or expecting to find that we can cut, cut, cut by that much year after year after year. What I was getting at was that clearly the Board of Ed, again, is an agency that just enrages everybody who deals with it.
Oh, yes.
And it's very hard defending lots of what it does. And clearly it has, as the mayor says, bloat in places. What I would object to is his labeling all the people who are not teachers as non-pedagogical, which is what the Board of Ed calls them, non-teachers, but that they're all therefore administrators. Because they include, as I said, school crossing guards and cafeteria workers, and somebody has to be doing those jobs. So I would say those have to be looked at.
Thank you for the clarification.
My name is Alvin Levine, and before I ask a question, I'd like to ask you something. What is the commuter tax now? What percentage?
0.45%.
Pardon?
0.45%.
The commuter tax.
It's the commuter tax on the income on commuters is 0.45%. Or yeah.
No, it isn't. The city tax is 4.5 on city residents. On commuters, it's different. What is it?
On commuters from New Jersey, you're talking about then?
Any commuter who doesn't live in New York. What
I'm saying is somebody who comes from a surrounding community from New York State pays New York City income tax of 0.45%.
Do you have
If you come from New Jersey, you have to pay the full New York State income tax, but New York State will not allow the city to raise its personal income tax on commuters.
If you're a resident of, say, Rockville Center in Long Island, you don't pay 4.5 city tax.
0.45.
4.5.
0.45.
Oh. Okay, then the question I have to ask...
It's 1/10 of what a resident pays.
Okay.
And we would argue that that's not fair and that it ought to be
All right, then
equalized.
my question is, why don't they raise the commuter tax? The commuter...
It's I'm afraid, politically very easy. As I was trying to get at, the New York State Legislature has to give us authorization to do anything to our tax system. The New York State Legislature has allowed the state to collect income tax from non-state residents, from commuters who come from New Jersey or Connecticut, for a very obvious reason. Where do they vote? Not in New York State. However, those same legislators will not allow New York City to put its income tax any further than 0.45% on people coming from other parts of New York State.
My question is, why don't they start lobbying to add 0.5%?
They have been. They've been working very hard. There have been
You never
different...
hear about it.
Well, it
Could we go to the
gets
next
done.
question, please?
John Tepper, Marlin. Speaking of the state, we've had no discussion of the state budget, which is at an impasse between the Assembly and the Senate leadership. Do you have any prognostication about when that impasse is likely to end and what the state budget is likely to do for the city this year?
You take that.
Well, I would avoid trying to predict when it's going to end. I think it's interesting, one of the ironies of the fact that one of the good things that's happening this year is the state has done away with what used to be called the spring borrowing through a whole set of measures having to do with reforming the structure of the state's debt. They no longer need to borrow every spring. That's a good thing. Glad it's happening. But it used to be the spring borrowing that put the deadline and put the pressure on the legislature to come to a budget, and that's not there. So it's interesting to see how long they can take to do what should have been done a while ago. And where it's going to come out, I don't know. I hope that the governor and the assembly hang tough, and if it takes a little bit more time, it'd be worth it if we could get substantial Medicaid funding reform. I guess I'm a little bit less concerned about how long it takes is what the ultimate outcome is. And I wish I were more confident that taking time was going to make it a better budget. That hasn't been the precedent in the past.
I think they are counting on, even though the Medicaid looks doubtful, the Medicaid proposal looks doubtful for this year, they have sort of been told that they'll make it up to them in different revenues. But in terms of looking at the overall structural deficit problem in the city, if the city did not have to pay a share of Medicaid over the past many years, which has become an increasing larger bill, there would virtually be no structural deficit.
That's right. It's almost exactly. It's about $2 billion that we pay. And as you pointed out, we're one of, I think, only 5 states that makes the localities pay part of the Medicaid at all, and we're the only one that makes the locality pay 50% of it. So that if that could be shifted, as you say, the gap would be gone.
Next question.
Sally Goodgold. I have a backup question if you don't want to speculate on my first question. But for 8 years, we seem to try to balance the budget with a piece of the Coliseum money. And I hope I don't have to ask this question next year again. However, if you were either Peter Stengel or Rudolph Giuliani, how would you solve it right now? Either of you, both of you.
I think I would say that, Mr. Zuckerman, sign up for the whole thing or pay us your $33 billion on Monday morning.
Do you have anything to add to that?
I don't know. I guess my reaction is I don't have a specific position on this, but I think that what the mayor needs to do is figure out a process that doesn't make him as vulnerable to the kinds of appearances of favoritism as he's got. They're in that sense, I think, a bad position. And whatever the process is, they ought to do something and not leave it hanging like this.
Next question.
Dorothy Silverman, this is for the Citizens Budget Commission. You talked of civilianization in the police department. Has any review been made of the extensive paperwork required when an arrest is made and which takes the police away from their active functions?
We haven't. I think there has been some work done, and in fact, they're looking for some savings by speeding the processing, the arrest and court process time, so that officers would spend less time on that and more.
Because New York City has one of the longest times of that arraignment to the trial times in anywhere, including other large cities. They have brought it down, as I understand it, by about 2 days. Worth of time that a person is in jail, but it's something very large, like 51 days average in New York State, which is an enormous cost.
This is one issue the mayor is quite concerned about. In fact, he has a proposal. They're looking at how to reduce that, and he uses that to defend the criticism that he's not looking for anything from the police department. But he's not looking for much else than that.
And the problem is that it's another one of those issues that we get dependent on the state for in large ways of making the state court systems speed up their time of response also. So it's a bargaining push-pull situation that has to go on, but the mayor is pushing on that one.
Seymour Taylor. Every time I pick up the paper, I read that the government is giving this builder money, that builder money. These people are entrepreneurs. Why are we guaranteeing them profits?
Your question,
You
Martha,
pay an 80-20 tax. We give back 80-20s. We give back many other taxes to these builders for services which the city will still have to provide. Fire, water, police, sewage.
Well, the whole
This is
thing.
part of your budget that you're giving away.
I think the whole issue of tax expenditures is enormously complicated. We have been very much in favor of what I think you're getting at, of really examining these more carefully, of what the cost is to the city and what the benefits we get back from the developer is. And I think the tendency has been for the city to bend much too quickly on the game of chicken that gets played. I mean, if you're a builder, of course you play on it, because I mean, I'm not going to build my building with it and pay full tax if I could build my building and pay no tax. I think the city could stand up to the game much tougher and make sure that we get our benefits back in the way the numbers of jobs, the number of low-income housings in exchange, whatever else goes on. I was very interested to hear Peter Salen's talk at a privatization luncheon the City Project had just this week, saying that he'd get rid of all these incentives, that they play favorites. And he's from the Manhattan Institute, which might be for trying to develop these buildings. But he says if the market doesn't need them, then let's not subsidize their building more.
I think you're going to see in the city council debate when the budget comes up some discussion about looking at economic development incentives in the city have been mostly to individual businesses, and whether there should be a greater shift of that into infrastructure where all businesses would benefit from.
You must remember that the jobs of construction are only run for about 5 years, and after that, these people do not pay taxes.
But I think that they're seeing the incentive there being that things that build up the infrastructure are good for businesses, not the construction jobs. Can we go to the next question, please?
Can I just say one more thing on that, Catherine, and that is that I think one of the problems is that the tax incentives don't show up as easily in a budget, and it's harder for the council also in oversight to get their hands around it. But it's just as much a payment as a direct payment to somebody to perform a service, as a direct contract. That you monitor, that the city council can see how much money is being spent, what do you get back for it. But it's very hard often to weigh these indirect backdoor subsidies to business.
Thank you.
Lowell Harris. We were told about the decline in employment in New York City is very tragic. My guess is that New York City is the business in New York City is taxed more heavily than any other place in the world. I'm not sure about that, but I think it's probably true. Do you have any proposals for moderating the tax system to encourage economic activity?
Well, we do that in two ways. One, to the extent you work on the expenditure side to become more efficient, all of the things we're talking about are in effect ways that potentially reduce taxes. But if we were going to think about tax changes that would make sense economically, probably two kinds of things to do. One is that there are now targeted taxes that are particularly harmful to individual sectors that people have made the case ought to be reduced or eliminated. Probably the leading example there is the hotel tax, which both the mayor and the governor have proposed doing something about. On a broader scale, I think it really comes back to the Medicaid and public assistance issue. I have always felt that these are tax issues. The question is how we pay for it. And right now we pay for it by saying that places like New York City that have a lot of poor people, the benefit, what goes with that on our tax system is that you'll also have a bigger tax bill. And then the businesses in the city will have a bigger tax bill than the parts of the state that don't. And we really ought to be paying for this on a statewide basis, which would mean some of this burden would shift to other parts of the city. But in fact,
other parts of the state.
Other parts of the state, sorry. And to the extent that it is the city which is the center of job growth, you make it more competitive. So I think if people began to see that, in effect, a state Medicaid takeover is an economic development program. It's a way to make some of the most attractive parts of the state more attractive and more competitive for business, and that ultimately we are part of the state's tax base. To the extent we shrink or grow, the state's tax base shrinks or grows. Once you think of it in those terms, it becomes smart tax policy.
I have a question for the two of you. There are a few people who disagree that the city doesn't need to get a handle on the deficit, that this $2.3 billion gap is real. You've got to do something about it. And if
By
the
law as well as by practical.
And if the mayor did not address that seriously in the financial plan and the budget, the watchdogs would be kicking and screaming. But a lot of the reduction is going to be driven by reducing employees, and you must reduce the number of employees. But how do you, in such a short time frame, do that so that it would be policy driven, that you decide that there's certain services we can do without for a while, and but what you see happening now in this process is they're looking for the places that are the easiest to get rid of some of the heads and get the savings, and there is going to be a substantial impact on the city. But how do you do the kind of thoughtful cutting that would be helpful in such a short time frame?
I would argue that there is some policy hidden in those targets, that you don't aim 4,600 of those 15,000. That's almost a third of the cuts out of the Department of Social Services, just because that's where there happen to be more people. It is a large department, but I think it is saying, we are saying our priorities are what we call the basic services of police and fire, and not of social services. So I think there is some policy underneath, though it's not being admitted to.
You do it on a priority basis, which is what Penelope's doing, and we elect people to do that, to decide if the budget has to be pared. Some things are more important than others. But I think you can also do it on the kind of efficiency terms that we're talking about, where there are opportunities to maintain the service with fewer people. Why wouldn't you take it there? So if you can maintain patrol strength, to come back to the police, and with fewer people, I think you're not doing the public a service by ignoring those kinds of suggestions. And similarly, in the fire department, we could invest in new kinds of equipment that would enable you to combine fire and ladder companies, provide the same service, not affect response time, but do it with fewer people. So I think if we were willing to consider that, we could move ahead.
I think one of the dangers, Catherine, picking up on that, is that you say headcount reductions in the Department of Social Services, and you won't, on the other side, make the investments in the technology that could indeed make those departments more productive and make them work more efficiently. So you take away, without building in over the period of time, the steps that are needed to make the service delivery work.
Come back to the commuter tax. Everything you said deprives somebody of something. Why don't you make a real effort to increase that tax 0.5% and even settle for 1/4%? Because the commuters undoubtedly get more than 0.5% worth of value. And you explain that to me wrong. It's 0.0045. And that's only less than 1/2 of 1%. They could pay 3/4 of 1% or 1%.
Lou Gershwitz, what has happened to the instant service courts which were set up for non-felony cases? How has it worked out? They were going to take the Longacre theory, and now the precincts are handling it.
I'm afraid I don't have my hand around that one.
Sorry,
where they are.
I don't think we can help you on that one.
Do you know?
There's a lot of savings within the
says she
budget where
knows.
those things were put in place.
I visited the court 2 days ago, and they are giving, they did 3 arraignments in 15 minutes. They gave out community service sentences. As a matter of fact, if you're a nonprofit in the Times Square district, they have a bulk mailing house. They do it for nothing. That's one of the things they do. They wash graffiti. They were out in 5 minutes taking on their sentences, and it's working extremely well.
Great.
Funny you should ask.
Great.
We just have a short time left. I'd like to ask a real quick question myself. I'm allowed to do that. It's my prerogative. For us budget fans, what should we be looking for in the next few months? The budget document I know will be coming out, but what will be the dramatic events? Is the deadline July 1st?
The dramatic events that May 3rd, actually, right next week, the capital budget is supposed to come out, and that will give us the information on the whole investments in capital infrastructure of the city and what they're doing to it with a 25% cut because of this. May 7th, the 10th will be the big budget, and then the hoopla. Then you get some real facts and figures, and the Catherines will go and be looking and digging out facts and figures. And the council will then work on it, and the council is supposed to adopt the budget with the mayor by June 5th, but I predict the end of June.
So by the start of July, you'll have a new budget.
Well, thanks very much. I'd like to thank everyone for being here. Penelope P. Sunyer, Chuck Brescher, Catherine Woodard. I'd like to remind the audience you've been watching the Friday Forum of the City Club. You're invited to join us. Give us a call. That number is 921-9870.
And it's time for another City Club Forum. I'm Sally Goodgold, Chair of the City Club of New York. I'm going to turn the program right over to our moderator, who's a former chair of the City Club, who's a professor of law, and the director of the Center for New York City Law at New York Law School, Ross Sandler.
Thank you very much, Sally. We are very fortunate today to have Allan Proctor with us. He is the Executive Director of the New York State Financial Control Board for New York City, which means that he plays one of the most important, indeed critical roles involved with the city budget and finances. The Financial Control Board has powers to review, but they also have powers to approve and take over, in effect, much of the city budget process if indeed the city does not do what it should be doing in balancing its budget. Those powers are in sunset currently, but they linger over the horizon, and it is always possible, if the city did not do what it should do, for the powers to sunrise, with the result that much of the city finances would be taken over by this state agency. Allan Proctor has been the person who's most closely followed the city budget over the last 4 years from his position as executive director. And indeed, not only has that contribution been important, but the intellectual contribution that he's made from the position is equally important. It is through his writings and evaluations of the city budget that the term structural balance has come into our vocabulary, and beyond coming into our vocabulary, has become accepted by virtually all participants in the budget debate, whether they're in the elected to the city council or their executive branch, or indeed they are such important personalities as union leaders who have to deal with the city budget on a very direct and personal way. So the term structural balance, which he'll talk about, has come into our vocabulary through his work and writings and those of the Financial Control Board. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. I'm always interested in where people come from. He was born in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin, but right now he is one of the most important fellows in New York City. Allan?
Thank you very much, Ross, and thank you, Sally, for inviting me to talk to the City Club. I've never had this opportunity before, and I certainly appreciate it. We people who talk about the city budget are always happy to have an audience, because it's a topic that seems very dull and very droll, but it's something that seems to enter our lives on a daily basis. The Financial Control Board, I'd like to say a few words about what this institution is, because it's different, it's strange, it's not something we're really familiar with. The Financial Control Board was really created to create the process of financial planning. So the Financial Control Board has a particular way of looking at the city's finances. We look at the city's finances for its future implications. We look at the city's finances for, this is your policy and priority. Are you carrying it out? Are the actions in your budget consistent with your priorities? One very important thing, which I think you'll find when you ask me some questions, I'll have to decline to answer some, is by law, we are prohibited from having any opinions on how New York City spends its money. So we, by definition, have no axe to grind in terms of what one does, but we certainly will comment on what is being done and what the implications of that are. What I'm going to talk to you about is a topic that's being dominated by a lot of rhetoric these days, but we need to get a little background and a little some numbers to understand, and that's the topic of school finance in large cities. New York City is not the only large city in the United States. It is not the only city that has a school system. It is not the only city that has growing enrollments. It's not the only city that has immigrant populations and large special ed populations. We really should spend a little time finding out what other people do. And in fact, the New York Financial Control Board has spent the last year and a half doing a very, very careful comparison of other jurisdictions and how they handle their budgets. School finances is one of them, but we've looked at their revenues, their expenses, their capital budgets, and their debt service. And what I'd really like to give you a little background on is this notion of structural balance and why it's something that we've emphasized so much and why we think it really is the key to helping New York City to finally get out of these recurrent budget problems. The basic fact is that New York City has what we call a recurrent structural deficit. What that means is that we balance our budget every year, but a deficit opens up right away. And that there are basic underlying forces in the way in which we raise money and the way in which we spend it that very predictably lead to deficits. For example, this current fiscal year, 1994, it will be balanced. This year will end in balance. But we're talking about a $2.3 billion deficit that we have to close in a few months. When the city adopts its budget in June, there will be a budget that will, at least expected to be balanced a year from now. At the same time, a year from now, we will be talking about how to close a $600 to $900 million deficit for the following year. These deficits have been after us for a long, long time. Structural balance basically means that ongoing revenues are chronically insufficient to support ongoing expenditures. A prescription for perpetual budget problems that has a lot of bad consequences. It forces managers of city departments to spend too much time on the budget instead of managing their agencies. It distracts the decision makers and our political leaders from having to deal with the many things that are just as important, and some would argue more important, than the budget. The budget is just too much of a distraction. When you're in structural deficit, it means the budget is going to be on the top of your agenda year after year. And in fact, for New York City, quarter after quarter, we have budget problems. This is a particular problem for education in New York City because education enrollment is growing. That means the educational system wants more money than it's already getting. In fact, it wants to grow fairly fast. It wants to grow faster than everything else. We're already in a situation where the ongoing revenues that the economy in New York City can create cannot keep up with the growth of spending as it's now structured. So that means that schools are going to be in the vortex of budget struggles for the foreseeable future, and we need to get a good understanding of basically where we stand. The problem of structural balance is a lot better understood than it was before. Particularly in the last 4 years, there's been a lot of discussion about it. I think now people understand it fairly well. But it's important for us to also understand that this problem has persisted in New York since before the 1975 fiscal crisis. One of the ways to think about this is the way we raise money, taxes, revenues, fines, fees, doesn't link into the economy well enough to support where we spend money: public safety, education, environmental protection, and so on. The way in which New York City spends its money has not changed since 1975. The pie has gotten larger, but the way the pie is divided up is strikingly unchanged. If you looked at the slices in 1975, in 1981, in 1986, in 1990, this year, what the city expects to be in 1997, you will see the largest change will be only 2 percentage points in that whole pie. If you looked at a picture, your eyes wouldn't even be able to tell you that anything had changed. For example, public safety and debt service, which have been talked about so much, and I will talk about them again today, are expected to be exactly the same share of the budget in 1996 as they are today, as they were in 1987, as they were in 1981. That is just remarkable. Now, how we divvy up has changed. How we spend on social services has changed, but it gets the same slice of the pie. How we spend on public safety, we've had huge swings from corrections to police and to corrections, and we'll be going back again to police. But the total amount, that share, is unchanged. So we should really look at how other cities divvy up their pies. We should see how they spend their money, because if we clearly have a way of spending money and raising money that doesn't work for us. So let's see what other people can tell us. Well, the first thing we do is, who are we going to look at? One of the biggest factors in New York is we spend a lot of money on capital, the capital budget. And so we had to look at cities that have large capital programs. There aren't a lot. So we found that for our comparisons, we compared New York City to Chicago, Houston, Los Angeles, and Boston. When we look at revenue structure is how you raise your money. Do you raise taxes versus fines versus federal aid and state aid? What kinds of taxes? Property taxes, income taxes, sales taxes. We found that New York City raises its money in virtually the same way as any other large city. We tend to be very heavily dependent on taxes. We complain about fines from parking tickets, but it's about the same as any large city. Parking tickets are a large city revenue phenomenon. We get about the same amount of federal and state support as everybody else does. The only major difference is how cities try to reach for their strongest linkage into the economy. Other cities, it tends to be the sales tax, a very, very critical sales tax in their revenues. For us, it's an income tax. But in general, we both reach into the economy for how people earn and spend their money in the same way, and we charge for services about the same way everyone does. Because of this tremendous similarity in how New York City raises its money compared with other cities, you come to the conclusion that the major problem underlying New York City's structural problem, these persistent deficits, is how we spend money. And in fact, when we look at how New York City spends money, we see that there are some very, very important differences. One of the first things you see when you look at New York City's budget, and if you look at what is driving this expenditure growth, is that you will see a number stick out on the line that says debt service. Debt service for New York City is expected to grow 35% between now and 1997. Since 1990, it has already grown 51%. The pace of growth of debt service in New York is twice the rate of growth of Medicaid. It's twice the rate of growth of employee health benefits, and it totally swamps the rate of growth of spending on personnel. When you see what is causing expenditures to outpace revenues on a chronic basis, you come back over and over again to debt service. When you look at how much of that debt service is, you also see that the amount of debt service compared to the tax base in cities is that New York City stands out once again. By 1990, most of these large cities were already pulling back from debt burdens, as we call it, because they couldn't handle it. New York City is heading right towards those debt burdens, and it's going to reach or exceed them in the next 4 years. I think the retrenchment of other cities is a clear warning that New York City's current plans to expand may be harmful. At the same time, it's legitimate to view high and rapidly growing debt service as a component of a necessary catch-up of capital spending that may justify cutting back other operational areas of spending in order to maintain budget balance. It's important to understand, though, that in 1990, before this huge expansion in debt service growth began for New York City, in 1990, our capital budget on an absolute basis and on a per capita basis, that is, against the population, already was larger than any capital program in any city around the country by several orders of magnitude. We already were a huge capital program even before this debt service started catching up on us. One of the most intriguing differences when you compare New York City, though, is other cities, and I'll give you some numbers a little later on, other cities focus their capital programs on maybe 3 areas. We spread ourselves very thin on over a dozen areas, and as a result, I think we don't get quite what we wanted to do. On the operating side, careful comparison says New York City apportions its money about the same way other cities do, but in virtually every single area, we spend more on a per capita basis. What that means is we are pulling out of our economy a lot more for every single service area than anybody else. Other cities are able to provide what's considered basic services, social services, and other things without having to pull so much out of the economy, and that's a very big puzzle. Now, New York City spends like an large urban center, but in each area it spends more than other urban centers. We have to figure out who are the winners and losers. One of the main losers from New York City spreading itself thin is education, both in operating spending and in capital spending. Now here I'm going to have to give you some numbers because the numbers are so important to understand. What we've done is we have created a way of comparing school spending and spending in other areas. Why do I have to say created a way of spending? Well, New York City has a school district, but Chicago doesn't have a school district. Its school district is separate. It has separate taxing powers. Los Angeles School District is not part of the city of Los Angeles. Social services spending and corrections are generally done by counties. New York City's a county, Boston's not a county, Los Angeles has a county, but it's a smaller part of it. Everyone knows Cook County is bigger than Chicago. So basically what we have to do is we compare New York City's spending on a per capita basis with the average of all spending in the states these cities are located in. So I can pull in all the school districts, all the welfare offices, all the probation offices, no matter where they're done, by localities. So I don't have to worry about, is this done by a county, is this done by a city, is this done by a school district or a special district? The reason I do that is New York City does everything. We are coterminous with county lines, with school district lines, and all of those things. The reason I dwell on that, and it's really kind of boring to have to say that, is people love to pull out numbers and statistics, and I've seen tremendous numbers of comparisons of New York City with other cities. But it's all apples and oranges. I know that I will, if I look at data on New York City against Chicago, I will see that New York has more school spending, because we have a school district they don't. I'll also see we have more park spending, because Chicago has a parks district. I will also see we have more library spending, because Chicago's library is a separate government. So one really has to kind of be careful on that. So having given you that long preamble, let's talk about education. New York City spends, this is in the 1990 was the year we had to look at, because it's the last year you can get comparisons for all governments when we started this study. New York City spends $857 per capita on schools. Boston spends less, $753. All localities in Massachusetts spend less, in the mid-700s. Illinois spends in the low 700s for all localities. All localities in California spend $846 per capita. Close to New York, but still less. Texas spends in the high 700s per capita on schools. New York City puts a lot of money into, it draws a lot of money from its population to put into the school system. So we know that New York has problems. We know that enrollment's going to grow. In fact, we create the equivalent of a new school district every year. We add about 20,000 new pupils every year. We know we have a lot of special needs students. We know we have an immigration population that needs a lot of effort to do catch-up. So in order to do the job we want, we're fundamentally saying that New York City needs to spend way above average compared to other cities. Well, we already spend on every other area more than other cities. So the real dilemma that is such a hard struggle in New York City is, what are we going to spend less on? And that's really a very tough decision, and it hasn't been made yet. Let's kind of get some ideas. I didn't give you one number. The one number I didn't give you is the average spending by localities in New York State on education. In New York State, the average spending is almost $1,100 per capita. That is a lot more than New York City. Well, what gives? Well, you'll say, well, all those other districts and all those other towns are richer. When you compare New York City to all other localities in New York State, you come with a finding that to me was very surprising. You find that, well, what you leave out is you leave out the Health and Hospitals Corporation. It's a separate issue. You leave out the Housing Authority. It's really not part of New York City government. You leave out the Transit Authority. It's really not part of city government. But you pull everything together: social services, public safety, parks, general government, environmental protection, transportation, education, all those myriad miscellaneous services. New York City spends $2,500 per capita. All other localities in New York spend $2,600 per capita. That's the same amount of money. New York basically draws the same amount of money out of its population for spending as everybody else in New York. But let's break that down in the areas. On education, New York City spends almost $400 less per capita. It spends $200 per capita more in social services and in public safety. In New York City, the zero sum, because money doesn't grow on trees, has been it comes out of education and goes into public safety and social services. Everything else is about the same. Parks and recreations, we spend the same amount as everybody else. General government, we do not have any bloated government compared to all other localities. We're in $3. We spend the same amount on general government, administration, special assistants, so any name you want to call, whether you like that spending or don't like that spending, it's the same amount. Transportation, we spend a little less, but not a terrible amount. Large plethora of little things, it's always in miscellaneous. It's about the same. So, surprisingly, the data say that New York City does not spend less than other governments in New York State. We spend about the same. But we make a swap. And the cause of this structural balance, this inability to let that spending can't keep up with revenues, and how are we going to try to rebalance our budget every year, has generally worked against education, and everything else has been roughly neutral. Now, I want to talk about the capital budget, because it's an area that's been very much, had a very high profile in the last several weeks. As you know, the New York City came out with a revision to its 10-year capital strategy just a few days ago, and there's a debate going on as to whether the Board of Education got enough money. Capital spending is very similar to operating spending in this regard. Just like operating spending, New York City spreads itself thin. So even though we spend a lot of money on capital spending in general, we don't really plow a lot of more money into anything in particular. How much do we spend more? New York City spend about $530 per capita on capital spending by 1990. It's clearly grown since then. Los Angeles was 10% less. Chicago was 1/3 that level. Houston was 1/2 that amount. Boston was 1/2 that amount. The average in New York State was 20% less than New York City. The average of localities in California was 40% less. Illinois was half. Texas was half. Massachusetts was 1/3. We spend a lot. But this is the question that I always ask, and because the answer is so counterintuitive. What areas do you consider to be in greatest disrepair in New York City, knowing that I just told you we spend more on capital than anybody else? Roads, bridges, schools. Well, roads, bridges, and schools, we spend far less than anybody else. On everything else, we spend far more. New York City puts into schools, roads, and bridges 20% of its capital budget. Only 1/5 of our capital budget goes into what I think most of us think is the entire capital budget. New York State localities on average put half again their share into roads, bridges, and schools. 1/3. 1/3 of all capital spending in New York State localities is roads, bridges, schools. New York City doesn't. Massachusetts, it's 1/3. California, it's 1/3. If you look at localities in Illinois and Texas, 1/2 of all their capital dollars go into roads, bridges, and schools. If you're going to borrow money, if you're going to build something, that's what it's going to be. But not in New York. So if New York spends 10% to 1,000% more on total capital projects than do other localities, what is it we spend capital dollars on that others don't? That's a really hard question to answer. As I said, we don't specialize as much as other cities. And it's easier for me to tell you what other cities specialize in. If you looked at Los Angeles, you'd see most of their money goes into their water and sewer system. Makes sense, they're in a desert. They own electric utilities, so they have to spend a lot of money on that electric utility, and then it's their schools. Everything else is small. Chicago, highways, bridges, housing, they own their airport, so they put a lot of money into it, and education. In Boston, it's schools or hospitals. So they have a lot smaller capital budget overall, but all of it goes into those two areas, so they can really focus it. In Houston, it's water and sewer, airports, they run an airport, and schools. With some exaggeration, the areas that New York City spends on that tend not to be very important in other jurisdictions are corrections, sanitation, public buildings, housing, and economic development. They account for 38% of our capital program, or $1.5 billion a year. And they are not areas that other cities view as a major way to spend capital monies. The choice by New York City to take a very capital-oriented approach to these areas could be viewed as a decision to redirect capital money away from roads, bridges, and schools. Now, that doesn't mean that those services are necessarily neglected. A good example in the last week was New York City has decided to spend $140 million of capital funds on a facility to make meals for its jails. That's very representative of how we spend money. Our correction system, we spend a lot of capital dollars on. Other places don't. They would tend to let someone else, some private firm or some existing facility, provide the meals. The other reason outside of spreading ourselves thin and not specializing why we have a huge capital program but don't necessarily feel we have the fruits of that is because we choose to own or be responsible for a lot of property that's not generally common. For example, I think you read in the papers in the last couple weeks that Chancellor Cortinas is going to sign some leases on some buildings. In the capital budget is a plan to spend $20 million of capital funds to refurbish facilities we are going to lease. In other jurisdictions, they'd say, I'm not going to spend capital money on something I don't own. But that's one of the reasons why we tend to get a lot of capital. Why do I dwell on capital? Because the other thing that makes New York City different than most other jurisdictions is we borrow for all of our capital program. That's not typical. It's not typical to borrow for everything. The reason that's significant is borrowing roughly doubles the cost of a project. If I borrow, clearly it takes less out of my budget this year in order to build something, but with the interest over the years, I'll end up spending twice as much as I would have otherwise. When you're in a situation of structural deficit, that means you are handicapping your horse even more. You can't keep up. You're putting more interest out there into the future that your economy just isn't going to be able to generate the extra revenues to deal with this more rapidly growing debt service. Now, I can't talk about capital spending unless I talk about maintenance spending. You know, there's that old saying, a stitch in time saves 9. I don't think that's an old wives' tale because that's an engineering study. You will find that repeated over and over again. Probably one of the most well-known examples was a study that I believe Ross Sandler did on bridges when he was commissioner and found the amount of extra money you'd have to spend on capital projects because you didn't spend $1 on operational maintenance was just a tremendous number. Now, since New York City borrows for these capital projects, you could really say a stitch in time saves 18. While one of the wonderful things that came out of the city charter was the requirement that you have to have some engineers every year decide how much would you have to spend in order to maintain your existing facilities. Well, what that lets you now know is how much is in the city's budget to support it. New York City has a very disappointing 40% is all of the estimated maintenance needs are funded in the budget. Now, if you were to fund this completely, you wouldn't radically change the budget because we're talking about spending maybe $250 million on operating maintenance. We're not talking about billions of dollars. We're talking about if you funded all of the estimated maintenance needs to keep your existing assets in a state of good repair, you would need to spend about $250 million a year. We spend only 40% of that. For the school system, we spend only 5%. So on the one hand, we are having a public debate, should we spend $7.3 billion of capital money on new schools or should we spend $3.3 billion of capital money on new schools? And nobody wants to spend a penny on keeping up the schools we already have. That is what gives us a tremendous need for capital money today in schools because we didn't spend it before, and it guarantees we will need capital money in the future unless we change that. In sum, you cannot make a strong case that New York City is underfunding education in the sense that we are pulling less money out of our economy than everybody else. Rather, in New York City, education has to compete with a lot more alternative uses of funds than is generally the case in other cities. The key to more adequate support of education in New York City, therefore, must be two critical areas. One, figuring out, if we can figure out, how to reduce the number of services against which education must compete so that a relatively larger share of existing capital and operating budget pie can go to education. Second, clearly we must work on improving the management and the accountability of spending in the Board of Education so that the current very representative level of spending on operating funds in education can buy a much better quality of service. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you very much, Alan. That was really a very, very excellent talk on a very difficult subject, and we compliment you for presenting difficult budget issues as clearly and with such lucidity as you did. This is the City Club. It's our regular Friday luncheon, and we invite all of you in the television audience to come join us at our regular Friday luncheons. We now ask the audience to come forward and ask questions, and as we do on our at our weekly luncheons, we ask that you line up, ask the question, and please no follow-ups. And if another question, go back at the end of the line, and we'll take it a second time. So we'll begin with the first questioner, please.
I'm Joseph Rosenblatt. I would like to know how our total debt relates, what percent is it of our annual budget, and how does our relationship between debt and our annual budget compare with a Chicago, LA, other major cities?
Sure. I'll give you some numbers. We've produced this study. If you'd like to get it, you can get it from the Financial Control Board. If you call 417-5062, we can mail you a copy of our study of comparisons with other cities. Roughly, the best number, you ask the percentage of total spending. The really good number to ask
debt, not
is
spending.
the percentage of debt service, interest and principal repayments on taxes. What's important about taxes is where the money's coming from to pay all this debt, and taxes are what go up and down, so that when we hit that recession the last 4 years, it was that debt service that was just killing us. In terms of total spending, New York City spends about 12%. In terms of its tax revenues, it spends about 16%, and it's expected to grow up to 19%. 4 years ago, the city's plan was it was going to go up to 22%, but Mayor Dinkins made a very wise choice that was a level that clearly couldn't have been supported, and he took a lot of steps to bring it down to about 19. Cities like Chicago and Boston were getting near levels in the 19 or 20, and they went into almost total cessation of borrowing. They hit a wall. They found when they hit that level, they couldn't handle it. They had to stop. Now, New York City, when you look at numbers, you can think that their debt service is going down, because often what you'll see is debt service which is called general obligation debt service. New York City now supports the hospital system with its own bonds. It's the same money that pays the debt service, whether it's a city bond or a hospital bond, but it comes off the budget. So when you look at the city's budget figures, you'll see general obligation debt is not quite so high, but it's because we moved a lot off budget. The court system's off budget. Dormitory authority is going to do the borrowing. We're going to do the paying. The Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Environmental Protection is off budget, and Transit Authority is off budget.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question, please.
My name is Norma Hart. What, if anything, might there be about the shape of our socioeconomic pyramid in the city and other aspects of the city's demographics and factors impinging on the population that is served that might have brought about the difference in the way we distribute our expenditures, with more going to social services and jails and less to schools?
Well, I think it's hard for me to answer that question, because the amount that goes to schools versus social service or public service is the same as it was roughly 20 years ago. So the question you're really asking is, what is it about New York City that's different? Mm-hmm. And I direct you to a superb book by Esther Fuchs, who's a professor at Barnard College, called Mayors and Money. And she studied New York City over the past 50 years and compared it with Chicago. And she came to the conclusion that New York City has evolved into a political process that does not work, in the sense of picking one thing over something else. that, and I think you can see that, when you see budget cuts, they tend to be across the board. New York City likes to reduce employment. When it chooses to reduce employment, it likes to do it by what's called attrition. Attrition means whoever quits, that's it. It's random. Well, we're a big enough budget that the law of averages says it's going to be across-the-board cuts. And that tends to be how we make our decisions. So I have to really not give you an answer on that because I'm not a politician and I'm not in political science, but her book gives you 300 pages of a political science knowledge about what it might be that might have to be fixed.
Thank you.
My name is Marilyn Rosenblatt. I hope the powers that be read that book. From your
It's got very small type.
it seems that many people who have the ability and the power to allocate funds are not using the common sense. And it was shocking when I read in the New York Times, New York City has a budget of $32 billion in that area, and the next lowest was under $3 billion of the other big cities. And of course, your explanation shows that. And it seems that there might be ways of reallocating. Could you comment also, is there any validity in the fact that New York City has more of everything, including more problems and more wonderful things that this country has to show off, that the federal and state don't have more input into making New York City work better, because we do have so much more of everything, plus and minuses?
Well, that's 20 questions all at once.
Sorry.
Some of them I can't answer. Some of them I can answer. First, whenever you talk about what does the federal and state government do, you have to realize that that's the same question that's asked in every big city. New York City gets about the same combined total as every other big city. In fact, if you looked at the state alone, you'd see that New York City tends to get a lot more support than the Chicagos, the Bostons, the Houstons, the Los Angeleses. But there is an important thing to realize. In the 1980s, when there clearly was a movement of the federal government out of a lot of programs, what happened in many other jurisdictions, they said, if you, the feds, aren't going to pay for it, we aren't going to do it. New York City, because it has such a big heart, said, these things need to be done, we will pay for them now. And that kind of decision isn't necessarily a bad decision or a good decision, but it has financial consequences. Is we have decided what we want to do, and we will do it regardless of whether someone else will help us pay for it or not. It tends to be that things come onto the budget when someone answers it. For example, Mayor Giuliani made a very, very insightful statement in the last several weeks. There's a federal crime bill that would give localities money to hire police for a finite period of time. And Mayor Giuliani, who, like Mayor Dinkins, is very familiar and with the structural problems of New York, said, wait a minute. If you, the feds, give me some money to hire police, it means I have to put more money into police. Moreover, you're going to stop giving me money for police in 3, 4, 5 years. So if I'm going to want to keep my higher police, I'm going to eventually have to pay twice as much. So he said no. That's the first step to break that kind of trap that we get drawn into doing things that other people say no. And it sounds hard-hearted for me to say that, but the fact of the matter is, because we're trying to do everything, we're spreading ourselves so thin that I don't think we're doing anybody any favor, because we're not doing many things well.
Thank you.
Hi there.
Hi.
My name is Evelyn Rich, and my question involves educational financing.
Mm-hmm.
The City Club is a member of a group called the Educational Priorities Panel, which has really done a great deal to study the whole question of financing the schools.
Mm-hmm.
A recent study, which the panel commissioned and which was done at NYU, showed conclusively that the amount of money which the Board of Education spends for administration is significantly less than the citywide average. The challenge that the New York City Board of Education faces is the increasing enrollment of special education students and the mandates of PL 94-142, which describe the funding requirements. My question is this: in that context, what steps, if any, can your board take? One, to ensure that operational funds provided the Board of Ed are sufficient to meet the instructional needs of youngsters outside the special education rubric. And secondly, how can New York City meet the requirements which the federal mandate has for special education, and at the same time address the other needs of an evolving population which is increasingly immigrant?
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to disappoint you, because that is one of the specific areas where the law says we have no view. You asked, what can my board do in order to change how money is spent in the school system? We're absolutely prohibited by state law from having any views on that, because the law says that is for the political process to decide. What we can have views on is, can you track where the money is spent? There are some real difficulties that any chancellor would have or any mayor would have. You cannot know on any given day how many students are in school. You cannot know on any given day how many teachers showed up for work. You cannot know on any given month how much money went to a particular school in a particular school district according to the budget. The last year in which you have audited results for school districts in New York City precedes 1990. There is the accounting systems, the auditing systems, the very dry green eye shades kinds of things make it virtually impossible for anyone to know where the money goes. Therefore, you can't have much effect on redirecting. So I would say one of the most important things is New York City needs to find out where the money is. The chancellor needs to find out where the money is, and it needs to be the way you can for New York City. I can sit at a screen in my office and know exactly how many people were on payroll, this pay period, this department, in what areas. You can't know that for the Board of Education. And until you can start getting facts, you aren't going to be able to have a reasonable, unbiased public debate on how to spend money, because you have no idea how it's spent. And I would, in disappointing you and not telling you what you should do, I'd say we've got to know what we're counting. Then we can try to get past rhetoric and know what's going on.
I'm going to, as a moderator, ask if I do a follow-up on that. The Times, New York Times, just, I think maybe 3 weeks ago or a month ago, quoted significant figures about what the Board of Education were spending per student. I think the special ed students were something in excess of $19,000 per student, and the regular students something less than $7,000 per student, and with special ed accounting for, I think, about 20 or so % of the total budget of the Board of Education. Are we to believe those figures? Are they in the ballpark? Or are you telling us that that we don't really know how to make those comparisons?
I'd have to say those comparisons are very difficult. All I can say as an outside monitor, I have no ability to verify the accuracy of those numbers. I have no ability to do it, even if I wanted to. So in that sense, you have to go on faith. I think one of the reasons why it's very difficult to have a debate about school budgets is it comes down to trust. Do you trust one side's numbers or another side's numbers? And you don't have that ability to agree on what's really there. And that's really what I think complicates it a lot. Special education is a very complex area. It's an area that I think really goes beyond my competence to say a lot more. Clearly, there are children who need a lot of services. The law says they should get those services. I think the issue should be, are they getting exactly the services they need, and they're getting it in a cost-effective manner? Knowing a lot of people in the special ed world, I think if you talked to any teacher or administrator in special ed, you could probably get a long list of things that could be fixed.
Next question, please.
My name is Seymour Taylor. If we, the city, were to collect all the taxes due to it without rebate, would that cover our deficit?
Absolutely not. The problem is, what you asked about is a very legitimate thing to focus on, but it's a different problem. If I collected all of the taxes that I wanted, I would suddenly catch up. It'd be like one of your relatives sent you a check. But is that going to pay your rent for the next 5 years? It isn't recurrent. The problem is New York City's economy and the kinds of taxes we have do not maintain growth approaching the rate of inflation. Now, why do I say inflation? Because if I kept every service the same, no cuts, no improvements, inflation's going to happen. Health costs, pension costs, salaries have to go up. You're not going to ask someone to work for the city for no raises, more than for a few years. And our economy and our revenue base can't keep up with inflation. So the right question should be, is there something we should change about our revenue structure so we could keep up with inflation? When you see that, you come up with a couple quick things. One, we have 27 taxes. 12 of those do not grow. What that means is when a tax does not grow, you've got to cut a service the next year because that service costs more, or you're going to have to raise a tax or a fee. And those taxes are part of the tax burden that businesses object to the most strongly because they're on very narrow bases. But they don't grow, they don't help solve a structural problem. Secondly, we have a property tax system that has so many constraints on it, it is incapable of keeping up with the real estate market. And in the long run, real estate will keep up with inflation. Our property tax system, we are guaranteed, if we get a recovery in the real estate market, our property taxes will not pick up. We've got to change that law.
You don't reappraise these buildings?
It has nothing to do with appraisal. It has to the fact that under law, every private homes have to have the same share of the pie as every year. Apartments and co-ops have to have the same share of the pie every year. Businesses have to have the same share of the pie every year. What that means is your pie can't grow any faster than the slowest slice. The real estate market in commercial real estate is the slowest slice. We have a recovery going on in single-family homes, and we are not getting any revenue from that because the system does not allow it.
Thank you.
Jeremiah Blitzer. A recent economic study has indicated that the top 1% of people having high incomes have approximately quadrupled their income in the last 10 years. And I think it's reasonable to say that the services that you're describing, and especially education, have been in radical decline during that same 10-year period, 1979 to 1989. Are those unrelated phenomena?
That's too complicated. I really can't give you an answer. New York City has always been a city with great extremes of wealth and poverty. What New York City has done is it has designed a revenue system that allows it to tap those great areas of wealth and a spending system that helps it deal with the issues of poverty. It's been that way always. It's fairly typical of large cities, and it generally works. So that in terms of being able to come up with the right approach to government, I'd say America has dealt with that problem. New York City's issue is that we need to kind of rejigger things a little bit because it's not keeping up anymore. we made a lot of changes up through 1975 that caused us problems. And what led us into the fiscal crisis in 1975 has not changed. So what we really do now is we have a lot better fiscal systems, a lot better controls, a lot better way of counting beans, so that we kind of know we're in trouble with enough time to kind of bail ourselves out before it hits the fan as it did in 1975. That's all that's changed. What we need to really figure out is how to provide services to people who need it in a cost-effective manner, just to the people who need it, how to raise money from the people who are able to pay that money and make sure all of those who pay the money are paying what they're supposed to pay. That's basic management, and I think the real challenge in New York City is we have to start placing as high a priority on management as anything else. In Philadelphia, which everyone looks at with such great envy, the major problem they have found hasn't been labor, hasn't been privatization or non-privatization, it's been management. Their managers aren't up to the task. They're finding that their issues of retraining, incentive compensation, firing people who don't do a good job is where they are finding their problem is. That's the same for New York. We haven't gotten to that yet.
Next question.
Yeah. Claire Steinberger, school psychologist for 100 years already, and feels like
You're very resilient.
I try.
We're coming down to the end.
I
so
know.
Good question.
Yeah. This, what I was thinking of is, I don't know if you're, again, going to be able to answer this, but what hit me was you said the educational budget is not really as large, and you brought up the correctional system on the other end. And what I was thinking of, would it be, is this at all connected? If the priorities changed in the educational system, if we were doing more, let's pretend, with job training, career, blah, 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 more preventive work in that area, does that mean that we would have less need for the high level of jail and correctional system at this end? So I'm just playing with ideas like that.
I don't really know. One of the reasons, what you're referring to is how New York City spends its capital funds. New York tends to not put capital money into school buildings or maintain them. They were built 40 years ago, and we don't deal with them. On corrections, we just tend to put a lot of capital money into corrections. The causes for that kind of go beyond, the time we have to answer. It's a combination of federal court orders, state law, local practice. We tend to have big, expensive, capital-intensive jails, and other places have found that they are able to figure out a way to do it less expensively. I really can't give you a lot better answer than that.
Okay, thank you very, very much. You've been listening to Allan Proctor, Executive Director of the Financial Control Board. This is the City Club. It's our weekly Friday lunch, and we invite you to join us next Friday. Thank you very much for listening.